Tonight we have stories that will make your skin crawl, make the goosebumps rise, put a tingle down your spine, and maybe get you to walk over to the door to make sure it's locked. But we're not talking folklore here. The stories you're going to hear are absolutely, positively true. I know when we started, we were talking about hundreds of cases in national parks and forests, and now it's not hundreds, it's in the thousands, right?
Well, we're up about 1,600, and I probably have another 300 sitting on the cabinet behind me right now that I just haven't gone through to vet to see if they fit. But almost every day I get a new case from somewhere in the world. And it takes a while at times to get the information through, and many times I can't even get the information because of obstructions in that process. And as we've talked about before, our government, specifically our government, doesn't want to give up that information. And even though we have the Freedom of Information Act, and it's supposed to be that free release of information upon request, it doesn't happen like that.
Let's talk a little bit about how you are selective about which cases go in, because it's 1,600 plus that are included in the books, but you have reviewed many times that number of cases, and then you weed them out using various criteria so you don't sort of pollute what's left over. What are the criteria?
So imagine an FBI profiler that's looking at a series of bank robberies. And he's looking, say, first of all, at the San Francisco Bay Area and trying to see if there's bank robberies there that fit a profile for a certain individual. Mainly, let's just say it's a white male, 6 feet tall, always wears a bandana, simulates a gun, never shows a gun. He has these profile points that he looks for to grab another case. And using that same type of profiling system, that's what I'm doing with these missing persons cases. And I use a vetting out process at the beginning to ensure that we keep consistent, mainly if the disappearance is voluntary, meaning the person told his family, hey, I just want to drop out of society, I don't want to be involved with this anymore, I'm just going to take off. Or maybe it was a suicide. And any type of suicidal or mental health issues, we'll vet those out. And any type of criminal element, any type of evidence that there was a crime in conjunction with the disappearance, we'll vet that out. And then the last one is predation. Any type of animal predation at the scene, in the area, any type of thoughts that the search and rescue or law enforcement had that this person was maybe drug off and buried by a bear, cached by a bear, etc., it'll vet those out. So what we're left with is cases where canines, this is like the 99%, canines come to the scene, they can't find a scent, or they don't want to track. And that's a tough thing to determine from the handler. Sometimes they'll walk in a circle and they'll lay down. Sometimes they'll walk up the trail 15 feet and turn around and come back. But there's a lot of cases out there where the person is not found by canines. And that's criteria number one. Number two is they bring in FLIR. And FLIR is forward-looking infrared radar in helicopters. They'll fly the area and they'll look for a heat signature from a body or from a live person. Or sometimes they'll even see a bear in the area moving through. And if there's no heat signature, there's no FLIR reading, that would be another big reading, another big point on our profile. And then boulder fields. A lot of times people go missing in or around a boulder field, or they are found in a boulder field. And I know that sounds odd, but the number of times this happens is phenomenal.
So what are the criteria that Dave Paulides uses to include a case in one of his missing 411 books? We're going down the list. Canines can't or won't track. Dave, pick up the story.
There's also another one, and these things don't come out readily. If you study 100 cases, this is going to make a lot of sense. If you look at 5,000 cases, these things start to come out at you. Another one is that the victims travel long distances or get to phenomenal heights, meaning, say, a 2-year-old disappears, and the grids set down by search and rescue professionals in their books state that a 2-year-old should be found 95% of the time in 2 miles or less from the point they were last seen. Well, I have a lot of cases where these kids are found 9-10 miles from where they were last seen in the middle of the woods, and it makes no sense. Or when they're found, they don't remember anything. That's another key point. A lot of times when the victims are found, they don't have a memory. Now, in the movie, we went to great details to show these phenomenal distances. In one case that Les Stroud tried to replicate was a 2-year-old boy disappeared at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, was found the next morning 9 miles away over 2 mountain ranges, and we ended up tracking him down and interviewed him. He's a man now, and the story is really, really strange, and he says, I have no memory of anything. And so the phenomenal heights, thousands of feet up into the mountains, a 2-year-old disappears, and yet they're found uphill, way uphill.
You have one case in this book where a little girl is found on the opposite side of a really wide river.
Right.
She couldn't possibly have walked it or swam it. She was too young. Exactly.
So the distances, the heights, weather changes in conjunction either with the disappearance or the search. And this can be a lot of things, and you got to kind of use some common sense with this. If at the time the person disappears, a thunderstorm starts, a windstorm starts, a drastic weather change that affects the searchers. This happens a lot of times. And then as you're walking with a group of people, I've kind of coined this the point of separation. And if you're not thinking about it, it won't hit you right away. But there's a time when you're walking with this group and either you get tired or they pick up their pace or something happens and you get out of view. And that's the point that you disappear. And the group will say, they were just right there. I can't believe they got away. They were right here just a second ago. And then boom, they're gone. And when they bring the canines to that location, that's when they can't find a track or they walk in circles, they do this. Time of disappearance is usually late afternoon. And this next one, I only found this out after either talking to the victims or digging real deep and finding it in a coroner's report or deep in a law enforcement report. And that is that the victim had some type of disability or an illness that wasn't obvious to the people even who they were with. Meaning that maybe they were a severe diabetic, maybe they had early Alzheimer's, maybe they were autistic. But it seems that this comes up more often than not, meaning that there's two ends of this intellectual spectrum that seem to be at play a lot. Meaning you have a lot of people at one end that have severe disabilities and some type of illness or injury that puts them in this one end. And then on the other end, you have these physicians, physicists, and things that disappear that are equally bizarre, yet fit the same criteria. And then in this book, I figured this out, and it hasn't happened a lot, and it probably hasn't happened a lot because people don't talk about it. But there was an instance where a guy disappeared, and he happened to have a compass with him. And he talked to the law enforcement people, and he said, it was weird. Is part of the reason I got lost, I think, is my compass was malfunctioning the entire time I was out. And I wonder if that is something maybe inherently wrong with the equipment he had, or was there something in the environment that was affecting his equipment?
That you mentioned about medical professionals. We're going to get into that more into specific cases, but I don't remember that popping up in the other books that where you isolate that, or am I wrong?
No, and in fact, it was this book that I first heard about it, and I don't know how many times people are even carrying compasses these days, but, we have these GPS devices and, with phones and things that you can pull up trail maps on, so I'm not sure if it's happening more and people aren't talking about it. Hey, they survived, you found me, great, and that's the end of it, and they don't want to say anything. It's something I'm trying to keep my eye on more and more. I throw it out there because a lot of times when I'm on these shows, I'll say something, and then I'll get some emails coming later on, and they'll say, I was in the woods one time, and my compass started doing circles on me, and I couldn't figure out why.
There's a boulder and granite that plays a role that it's hard to figure out. And I can imagine when you start telling this story to somebody, these boulders, it's somehow related to the disappearances that they arch their eyebrows at you.
Right. And when I talk about granite and boulders, when I started this, I didn't realize that there's a lot of things in boulders and granite that, maybe the common public doesn't even know about. But as I started this process of understanding where these cases were at, I took out a giant map of the U.S., and I just started to put pins in the map of where these people disappeared. And after a while, certain areas started to grow very large. And the largest cluster of disappearances fitting this profile anywhere in the world is Yosemite National Park. Now, what does Yosemite have that other places don't have? Probably one of the largest clusters of granite anywhere in the world. And the disappearances in Yosemite, I'm sure the thousands of people out there are thinking, oh, somebody went into the woods and they were on a long hike and they just got lost, they fell off a cliff and died, nobody found them. Well, the reality is that there's a lot of these cases of super smart people who went into the park, dropped their stuff in a hotel room, and asked somebody, hey, can we go here or there? And they give them directions to a location. They're on foot. They don't have a backpack. They don't have hiking shoes on, and they disappear. And this has happened more times than I probably told you about in these shows. But Yosemite, for some reason, has a lot of these very, very strange disappearances. Many times the people are never found. Now, Yosemite also has this unusual activity with it in that the National Park Service, if I name a name and a location where somebody disappeared, and I have somebody else request the report, the Park Service will give it up. Now, in Yosemite, if somebody names a name and asks for a report, they will never give it up if that person's missing. And it's only to that one park that they won't give up any reports. There's one case I've talked about every time I'm on this show, a girl disappeared named Stacy Arras. The case is 30 years old now, or more. And they will not release any details about the case. About 6 months ago, they released this, they said, we're releasing case files. They never released the case file. They released some pictures, some articles about her. They will never release the incident report, even though it's classified as a missing person report. Every missing person report I've requested out of Yosemite has been denied.
It's ridiculous. I don't get it. Don't they want the public's help with this stuff? Get the word out? Let's talk about this book, Broad Strokes. How many cases, how it breaks down. It's not, you started with U.S. national parks and national forests. It's much, much broader, of course, now.
Yeah, initially, I was looking at just the U.S. and Canada because that's where the information could easily be gleaned from. Over time, and as people realize that this is an international issue, I started to get more cases from overseas. Last year, I took a trip to Australia. I spent 2 weeks there, and it was a book tour. But in between that, I went out and I met a family that was actually a U.S. family, Patrick and Elizabeth, Liz. And they helped us, and they took us around, and they showed us a series of disappearances that we were interested in near Leura, Leura, and it was directly adjacent to national parks. The profiles of these people that disappeared in that area were a direct hit to what we're talking about in the U.S. Now, it's the U.S., Canada, the U.K., Australia, and New Zealand would be the top places in the world right now where there are disappearances that match what we're talking about here. Now, I can almost guarantee for a fact there's other places in the world that match these disappearances as well. But for me, getting the information and getting reports out of these areas is difficult. Now, going there and doing it may be a probability, but as you know, that's super expensive to do.
And the language barrier. You're talking about places where English is spoken mostly. The cases that you have, yeah.
And in fact, when we went to Australia and we visited some firehouses where people played a part in the search, we talked to other people that knew these victims, and when you start to get down to the nitty-gritty, in one case, this woman disappeared, and in the press, they said that she had early case of Alzheimer's, early onset, and she had the first early symptoms. Then when we talked to friends of hers, they said, that was a complete lie. I don't know why they put that in there. And that has happened many times in the U.S. on cases I've investigated as well. They say there's Alzheimer's early onset, and it's a complete lie. And it might be to try to explain away to the public why this is happening, but in reality, it's not happening for that reason.
You have some cases from New Zealand that are mentioned in this book as well, and I don't want to jump too much out of order here, but toward the back of the book, and did you dig into those while you're on that same trip, or did these come to you some other way?
They came to me some other way, and there's a lot of rationale in those cases in New Zealand. And if you ever get there, they have big mountains like we have in the United States, say in the Sierras or in the Rockies, and they have a lot of area above timberline where there's no big trees. And there's some disappearances there that mimic disappearances here, in that a person's above timberline and there's no place to hide, and they're last seen walking through this area, and of course it's mostly all rocky, bouldery area, and they disappear and they're never found, and their backpack's never found, and their coat's never found, and nothing's ever found. And in normal disappearances, people will start shedding things. You're carrying a backpack and you're on your last leg, you're going to start getting rid of things. And it's not a wise thing to do. It's probably best just to stay in one place, huddle up on a knoll top or a ridge top, and wait for help and wait for aircraft to come and find you. But that's not how a lot of people do things when you're starting to, haven't had food, water, etc. But these disappearances in New Zealand mimic the disappearances in the States and in Canada almost identical. And one of the things I talked about when I talked at the Search and Rescue Conference was that in the books, the search and rescue books that are given to these volunteers and professionals that go out and look for these people, there's a 95th percentile, and they'll say, well, 95% of the time a person will be found in this area. But it doesn't address the other 5% of the times. And are we searching for 95% success, or are we searching for 100% success? And I can't tell you the number of times searchers have said, Dave, we've always thought about that, but we never want to talk about it. And then when they read the books and they realize, wow, these are just facts that he's put together. There's no opinions in here. There's no stating that there's a big monster out there taking people. What I'm saying is that these are facts that people all need to be aware of. And many search and rescue people have now stated, Dave, we all know this is going on. We just don't want to talk about it. You finally put it in print.
Well, you referenced that 2012 presentation you made to that annual conference of search and rescue professionals, and I guess it was mixed reviews in the sense that you told them some things that were uncomfortable for many of them there, and then afterward, privately, some of them told you that kind of stuff, that they are interested in this, but it doesn't seem to be something they want to speak about openly.
Well, during my presentation, I kind of took a breath, and this guy in the back row stands up, and he goes, I'm an Alaska State Trooper. And he goes, I'm going to tell you, Dave, that you're the first person who's ever wanted to talk about this kind of stuff. He says, we face this all the time in our searches. And anyone in here who's done a lot of searches realizes this happens all the time. And he goes, I don't know why we're talking about it more. And then his friend who's with him is another Alaska State Trooper, stands up and says, he's 100% right. Well, and then I start talking about the 95th percentile, and a lot of people, you're 100% right, George, are very uncomfortable talking about the topic because it's hard to argue the facts that are laid out.
Well, I guess they might feel guilty realizing that they've just done the 95%. It didn't go literally the extra mile.
And that's always a $1 million question. Did they miss something within that 2-mile radius, or did the person go outside that radius? Well, one of the other vetting points, profile points that I include, that I talk about in my books, is there have been hundreds of times where a deceased victim has been found inside that primary search perimeter, that 2-mile radius, and they stumble onto it.
There's a quote from the New Zealand case that you profiled, Ray Cassidy, a guy who disappeared in 2001, an extremely fit 73-year-old who was hiking with a group on Mount Grey in New Zealand. And one of the searchers was quoted in Wilderness Magazine of New Zealand saying, this guy was seen 1 minute, gone the next. He completely vanished off the face of the earth. I've been involved with SAR for 50 years, and every now and then, one of these cases pops up when you're completely baffled because there's no logical explanation for it. And then one of the searchers is quoted as saying, it was just as though someone had come down from up above and zapped him into a flying saucer. How far back does it go? I realize the challenge is that the record keeping, that a lot of your criteria are confirmed via records, and that records only go back so far, but this could be happening throughout human history.
So you brought up a name earlier, guy I really respect, and I've read a lot of his research, and that's Jacques Vallée. And one of the cases that I've documented in past books occurred in 1752 in France. That's a confirmed case. And then just the other day, I participated in a Kickstarter on a book that Vallée wrote just recently. And I happened to be going through that book, and I found another case from the 1500s that he laid it out, and I couldn't have wrote it better. It was like a perfect match for what we're talking about.
So there are cases that go way, way back. It's just a matter of you'd have to get lucky to find records that would confirm that it fits your criteria.
Yeah, and a lot of times someone goes missing and they're found, thank goodness, it's over, and that's it, and there isn't a lot written about it. Other times there's a lot that's documented by people who intrinsically have some interest as to why certain things happen. And you can almost tell by the tone in the article from the reporter that they were as intrigued about it as I am today, and they decided to write a lot. And, you know, it goes back to where it happened, the educational level at the time. And, I mean, going back hundreds of years, there weren't a lot of people that had that kind of education, and hard to find.
You've got some material from this year that shows that it is ongoing, February, March, even April, starting with a guy named Danny Filippides. Remember that one?
Yeah, this case made big notoriety across the U.S. In fact, mainstream press picked it up because it was so unique. 49 years old, a Toronto fire captain, 28 years of service. February 7th, 2018, 4 o'clock. He's at the Whiteface Mountain Ski Resort in Lake Placid, about 40 miles south of the Canadian border. And every year, a group of current retired firefighters make the trip across. They spend a couple days skiing. Well, he was with a group of guys. One of his friends got tired. He said, well, I'll take one last run. Almost exactly the words that Grant Cox gave his friends when he took one last run. And he disappeared. Well, Danny's personal property was still in the lodge. Car was in the lot. His friend said, hey, he's got to be on the mountain. And a 6-day search, 7,000 hours, dogs, firefighters, nothing. And then, surprisingly, Danny calls his wife from downtown Sacramento and says, I have some kind of head injury. I'm not sure how I got here. I did take a ride in a truck for a certain period of time, like a trucker, and he dropped me off in Sacramento. And right now I'm at Sacramento International Airport, and I wanted to call you and tell you that I'm okay, but I don't really remember anything. Well, she said call the sheriff. He calls the sheriff. They come out, and they take a picture of him wearing the same ski clothes and the same ski helmet that he was missing. He was wearing the day he went missing. And he came back and he spoke to the New York State Police about what happened. And they never released the details of that conversation. But the people in Toronto said that he was an absolutely rock-solid fire captain with no mental health issues.
I remember reading about this case, and my first thought was, this guy slipped away with some other woman. He doesn't want to remember it because he doesn't want to tell his wife where he's been.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's probably where a lot of guys' minds went, except that, you know, you could kind of, why didn't he take a better set of clothes to change into?
He got a haircut, too, right? He got a haircut?
Yeah, and some people emailed me about that, and this is what I said. They said, well, first of all, where did he get the money for a haircut? And he also bought an iPhone because he didn't have a phone. Bought it in Sacramento. And what I tell people, I ski all the time, and I don't like taking my wallet with me, but I'll always take a credit card and slip it in my coat, so during the day I can stop on the hill and get something to eat. So him having a credit card, but he didn't have his wallet and he didn't have his passport, and he told the people in Sacramento, hey, I didn't fly here because I don't even have my passport. So I don't know how I got here.
Yeah, that's a good one. Have you reached out to him? Have you tried to talk to him?
No, in those kind of situations, I'm sure that he's probably embarrassed, doesn't want any more press about it, doesn't want any more acknowledgement. He probably wants to get back to his routine. And if it happened as he said it happened, he's probably scared to death. And one thing about that case that really rang true to me was him saying that he had a head injury. And he was wearing a helmet. And I'd be interested to see if that helmet had any damage to it. But it all kind of fits in. Why would he say he had a head injury? That's amazing.
You had another one, Dr. Jonathan Torgerson, a physician from Montana. This is also in February.
So there's some interesting coincidences here. So Dr. Torgerson disappears on the 17th of February, 10 days after Philippides disappears. Torgerson disappears from Whitefish Mountain Ski Area, and Philippides disappears from Whiteface Mountain Ski Area. And Whitefish Mountain in Montana is also 40 miles south of the Canadian border, just like Whiteface Mountain.
Huh.
Is that just all mere coincidence?
Strange.
So Dr. Torgerson lived in Montana, was an emergency room physician, kind of a staple in the community. And he decides, and he tells his family this, that he's going to ski outside the bounds of the ski area and actually take a padded path around the backside and make it down to the bottom. And a lot of people do this. It's not completely going off trail. Part of it is, but not all of it. And he took an avalanche beacon with him. That was smart. And he had his phone. And he intended to ski the northeast side of the area. He never came home. Well, a lot of people don't know this, but there's a very wealthy person that lives up in northern Montana, Kalispell, Whitefish area, and he's funded this organization called Two Bear Air, Two Bear, B-E-A-R. And what it is, it's a helicopter emergency service that will pick anybody up for free in that northern Montana area, and it's funded full-time with 2 pilots. It's an unbelievable service that's funded up there privately. Well, Two Bear Air searched for this guy for days, and Flathead Valley Avalanche Rescue responded, the sheriff, North Valley Search and Rescue, Gallatin County, Lewis and Clark County, and they all thought he might have fallen in a tree well, and that's this area around a tree that has this deep hole in it that sometimes claims a skier's life. They searched those holes one by one all through that area, and they pinged his cell phone, and it was last on near a ridgeline near this area called Kona and Flower Mount. It snowed heavily, wind was brutal during the search. They didn't find him. And to me, it's strange, not only the facts surrounding this, but also it's a physician. And in this book, Off the Grid, I write about a lot of physicians that have disappeared under very, very strange circumstances. And it goes towards that intellect on that far end of the spectrum that seem to disappear at higher levels than most.
You know, we've talked before about, can you carry something that would protect you, some kind of a location device or a beacon or a cell phone. And in this case, this guy, the cell phone pinged, but it certainly didn't stop him from vanishing.
You know, and I wish the National Park Service would get on board with this, because there is a device. It's a personal locator beacon. And if you guys people ever watch, Deadliest Catch, every boat out there on the Bering Sea has one of these waterproof location devices. Well, you can buy one. It costs you a couple $100 and works off a satellite. And if you're lost, you need help, you activate it. And within 10 feet, search and rescue can come and find you. And these things aren't as well known as people tend to think. And when I go to conferences, I'm surprised how many people have never heard of this. Yet anybody who walks in the woods by themselves needs one. And what I tell people is that you never think it's going to happen to you. You could be in the middle of the woods on the backside of some trail, off the trail, break your leg. Chances are no one is going to find you, and you're going to die out there. Well, the funny thing was, here I am preaching about this, And I was in Australia 2 years ago filming a segment on a missing person, and what did I do? I was carrying a huge camera rig, and it was raining. It had rained previously. I slipped over a boulder, and I broke my leg. I ended up being able to walk out with a straight break, but it was ugly. If I would have been by myself, it could have been trouble.
So Danny Philippides on February 7th. 10 days later, Dr. Torgerson disappears on the 17th. Same day, Ryan Schutka.
Now, Schutka was an employee of a ski resort called Sun Peaks, and it's just outside of Kamloops, British Columbia, 120 miles north of the U.S. border, and had worked there the entire season. It was the end of the season party, and he's walking from the party to his house just down the street, and he disappears. Now, he knew this this area by the back of his hand. He walked it every day all year. Well, the RCMP sent in multiple search dogs, multiple helicopters, 100 searchers. There was no evidence from anyone that he left the village that he was staying in. And his parents, Heather and Scott, were on scene daily. His dad used to be a heavy equipment operator and brought in a backhoe and cleared snow looking for his son. Now, the weird thing was there were a lot of closed-circuit televisions in this little community, and none of them happened to be working. So they couldn't see where his movements were at. And this search went on for weeks, and in fact, just up until a couple weeks ago, it was still going on, and his parents were still there. And I guess the hopes are is that with a spring thaw, they'll be able to find him. But how he disappeared in such a short period of time, walking such a short distance, there's only one other place I know of that things like this have happened, and there's two cases very similar to this that have happened in Whistler, British Columbia. One was a guy and one was a girl. The girl happened this year. Very, very similar circumstances.
The idea the camera's not working, is there something suspicious there, or is it just, it's a remote area, nobody's paying attention to the cameras, or is it likewise coincidental that all of them are out?
In the UK, I wrote a book called Missing 411, Sobering Coincidence, where I documented a series of young men that have vanished and were later found in water. And it's strange the way those things have happened, but in those little communities in the UK, there's a lot of cameras. And in almost every one of those instances, the person was seen, and then all of a sudden they weren't seen, and then the next thing is a week later they're found in the water. How they ended up in the water, that's the million-dollar question. But it's normally not a closed-circuit television issue, and a lot of times they have given some insight from searchers as to what might have happened. But in this instance, it's strange that they weren't operating.
And I don't know if you've gone this far as to find out, did they just stop at that moment, at that time, or they were out for a while, or, I
think these were out for a while.
Okay. One other one that happened in March. This is Thomas Malarkey.
So Malarkey, this is in Bear Valley, California, and he was an electrician. And this is an area where I've actually been through a lot with my daughter Nicole and my son Ben. We spent a lot of time up in the Sierras, up around Tahoe. And in this area of Calaveras County where they have the frog jump, Mr. Malarkey was a Richmond resident, and he had a cabin outside of Arnold, kind of near Bear Valley. And he liked to ski. He was an advanced skier. And his wife decided to stay in the cabin this day, and he went up to Bear Valley. Now, this is the second incident I've written about from Bear Valley. And you can add up all the ski resorts in the U.S., and there aren't a handful of them that have had these disappearances. Yet this is the second one in Bear Valley. I've skied that place many times. I don't understand how you get lost. And I don't understand how they couldn't find you. But he disappears. The search is termed on March 20th after the California Highway Patrol and the National Guard helicopters were grounded because it was snowing so hard. And there was 35 inches of snow that fell in 72 hours. That's a lot of snow for that area. But there was an army of people that responded. And Calaveras County, Alpine County, CHP, Air National Guard, and many volunteers. The family gave an interview and said, this is one of the true, real mysteries that we'll never understand, is how our dad wasn't found.
In the missing 411 off the grid, that you have all these quotations in the back from search and rescue people dealing with specific cases. And the one that jumps out at me, I'm looking for it here, pawing through the pages. I can't find it, but it was involving one of the rare cases where somebody comes back and they have shreds of memory. It's a little boy who believes that he was in the presence of a big kangaroo. Remember that one?
You know, and I try to tell people, don't put a lot of credence into what kids say, but it's been a big kangaroo, a big wolf, a big dog. One incident, the girl said the dog took my hat off my head as he was holding me and put it in its mouth. So kids have said the damnedest things, and you don't know if they're making it up or if it's truthful. But the big kangaroo one, that one was odd because I've never heard anything close to that before.
You take them all together, though. They remember a big dog or a bear-like creature. You've got also cases of what sounds like a Sasquatch carrying kids away. You don't want to read too much into that and blame all this on Bigfoot. But it does sound like there's a physical creature involved in at least some of these encounters of those who come back and have any memory at all.
So there you are, giving evidence to some of those people out there that are listening, George. But
I'm just trying to stir it up, Dave.
Yeah, you did. What I tell these groups is that you've got to look at the evidence. And the evidence says that around these scenes and from where these people have disappeared, there's no tracks, there's no scent. So how is something getting out of that area without leaving behind evidence they were even there? And that doesn't make any sense. So, I mean, you've got that UFO community saying, well, you know, it kind of fits that abduction scenario. You got the Bigfoot community living off the words that George Knapp just said. and who knows really what's happening? And I've never said that any one specific thing stands out, because when you look at the overwhelming evidence and you go back and you look at the geographical cluster map, it really throws it all into a loop. So the boulder issue is one that I've written about extensively, and I wrote a lot about it in this last book. And it has to do with granite predominantly. And the biggest cluster of missing people anywhere in the world that fit our profile is Yosemite National Park. And what does Yosemite have? But probably more granite than anywhere in the world. And one of the last stories in this last book dealt with a priest that was running from a group of people in the late 1800s, and he ran onto this giant piece of granite, and it said that the granite opened up and swallowed him. And a couple days later, he said he was spit out. And what's interesting to that to me is that it was a religious figure, and at the time, we always thought that those figures that wrote stories that held a lot of credibility in the world. And for him to write that, I thought was pretty phenomenal. The Shenandoah National Park, there's one case I wrote about in a couple of books ago. I don't remember the name off the top of my head. But walking around boulders and getting out of sight from people would not be something I would do. And when I'm in those boulder fields, I make sure that I'm with somebody. They see me, I see them. I don't know what goes on in those boulder fields, but it's not good.
The whole thing with the clothes is so weird, and it's hard to get your head around it. But you have those cases where the clothes are folded. You have other cases where the shoes, there's always something weird happening with shoes, and it's tough to explain it.
Well, it's especially tough to explain, especially when you're dealing with kids that have walked, 60, 70 miles and supposedly didn't have shoes on and didn't have them at the time that they were found. How did they make it those distances? And what I explain to people is that search and rescue people are so thorough. They're told to pick up anything on the ground and make a note of it where they found it, because it could be relevant to the case that they're working. And a lot of times they'll bring in all kinds of stuff, and the vast majority of the time it's not related to the person that's missing. but it shows how thorough they are. One of the guys that I work with is a guy named Harvey Pratt. He used to be one of the directors at the Oklahoma Bureau of Investigation, and he's also a Native American chief. A couple of weeks ago, Harvey and I were talking about Native American disappearances on reservations. He had a conversation with one of the Bureau of Indian Affairs captains, and the question had to do with how do they retrieve reports out of their system when they need to go to court, etc. And this guy at the time said that's one of the problems. They're having a difficult time finding out where these reports are going and how they're tracked. And it's one of those federal investigative agencies that seems as though it has the inherent problems that the National Park Service and the U.S. Forest Service has. Now, with the Bureau of Indian Affairs, they're greatly underfunded and they don't have enough investigators. But the disappearances of women on reservations is a serious issue. It doesn't overlap with what we're doing, but it's a serious issue. Well, we didn't get to talk about it tonight, but the one last case involved a German individual that disappeared skiing on the Matterhorn just a month ago, and they gave up the search for him. And he's a billionaire from Germany, and you know that they threw every resource in the book trying to find him, and they didn't. So I think that the German side of the equation has something that we really don't understand, but there's something there. And when you look at the physicist angle, why are these guys disappearing and why can't we find them? That's a real bothersome question.
Let's sort of lay the ground rules for those who are not familiar with the material. Do a recap, kind of how you got started in this, what the cases are that you look at, how you weed them out. Weed out the ones that can be explained through prosaic means.
Originally started by doing some peripheral research at a national park. I noticed a couple people following me around the park. I was interviewing people that were employees of the contractors in the park, not National Park Service employees. And at the end of the day, I went back to my room and get a knock on the door, and there's a person standing there, and they say, yeah, I'm a National Park Ranger. I'm off duty. I have some information for you I'd like to talk to you about. They come in. We had a conversation, and they told me that themselves and others that they had talked to had worked at several parks in the past and had worked missing person cases in those locations. And they felt that some of the locations that these people disappeared were odd. There was a lot of publicity in that 7 to 10 day cycle and a lot of news coverage. And then at the end of the initial search, boom, it was over. There was no more follow-up. They themselves had looked for information on cases, and it was difficult to find, and they couldn't figure that out and couldn't understand it. And after talking to other people in other parks, they realized that there's something really unusual going on, and they think somebody should look into it. And they knew my background, and they said, you should really devote a lot of time to this because there's something here. The next morning, called a couple law enforcement guys on the way home. I told them the locations to look at and see if there was anything unusual. And they called back in a couple hours and said, wow, there's something here. That's kind of how it all got started. Originally focused on national parks and then branched out into U.S. National Forests as well. The National Park Service has a large contingent of federally trained law enforcement officers, and they're throughout the national park system. These aren't the rangers wearing the Yogi Bear hats. These are actually dedicated law enforcement people that carry guns, issue tickets, and make arrests. They're better trained than most law enforcement officers in medium and small cities across the U.S. because they're trained at the Federal Law Enforcement Training Facility. They have an administration just like every law enforcement group. They understand the need for keeping information on suspects and missing people. If you look at most medium-sized and large-sized police departments across the U.S. and you look at their website, there's usually a section about missing people, and in that section, many times, there's photos and information about missing people. Every state in the U.S. has a missing person website. And the need to understand where people go missing, the circumstances of their disappearance, and the need to get publicity and to get that picture out in front of the public is known throughout law enforcement. That's why they put them on bags, they put them on milk cartons. It's really an important fact of the missing person investigation. Well, I filed the Freedom of Information Act against the National Park Service probably 5 years ago now, and I had an attorney call me back from the Park Service asking me why I wanted that. It was red flag number one. I explained that that's an inappropriate question. You can't use that as a deciding factor. He says, well, we already decided anyhow. We just wanted to know why you wanted it. And I said, well, what do you mean? He goes, well, I know you claimed an author's exemption because you have a published book, but your books aren't in enough libraries to qualify for that exemption, so we disqualified you.
What a total bunch of baloney that is. That's not in the Freedom of Information Act.
Of course not. And I said, well, can you point me to where that is? He goes, that's our policy. I said, oh, okay. I said, well, I'm interested in the number of missing people from Yosemite and from your entire system, as I had explained. And he came back and he said, well, we don't keep a list of missing people from Yosemite. And I said, well, that seems a little odd. You must have a list somewhere. He says, no. So I filed another Freedom of Information Act request because I thought it was maybe they were playing some semantics game with me on the request. So I wrote it again, and this time I got a written response from the local regional manager for the Freedom of Information Act for the National Park Service, Charis Wilson out of Denver. And she stated, no, they understood the first time there are no lists of missing people. And I said, well, how can that be? And she said, we rely, and this is a quote, on the institutional memory of our employees for that information. So I said, And she said, but we understand your request, and we understand you wanted to know if it was denied, if we could just quote you a price. So the price is $34,000 for a list of missing people from Yosemite, and $1.4 million if you want it for the entire system. Now, hindsight's always 20/20, and a lot of people have said this to me. They said, well, if you're relying on institutional memory, why should it cost so much? Just call the people in and ask. But, of course, I never got the information, and that started a hunt for us, going through archives, talking to national park rangers, people, etc., and we came up with a pretty healthy list of missing people from national parks. And because so many of the criteria match people who disappeared in national forests as well, we started to include those. And part of that, the factors that we use to eliminate cases is a voluntary disappearance or a mental health issue with the person, we wouldn't work it. If the person, if there was some relationship to animal predation, or there was some associating factor that showed that maybe the person was attacked by an animal, we excluded that. We excluded any where there was some incident or possibility of human-to-human violence. So those were all the factors that vetted out the peripheral cases. So then we stayed in the park with cases where the people disappeared, there weren't answers, the Park Service seemed to be standing in the way of us getting answers, and probably the cornerstone case to that is a girl named Stacy Arras, who disappeared in the next city over from me in Saratoga, California. She was 14 at the time, and she disappeared in Yosemite National Park. And her and her dad and 6 other people were riding on horseback into the back range, and they were staying at some cabins really in the middle of nowhere, Yosemite. And they got to the cabins. Stacy got out, changed clothes, and her and a 72-year-old man were just going to walk over to the point and sit down, and she was taking pictures with a camera. Everybody saw him walk to this point, sit down, and the older man sat down. They were at about 9,500 feet. She told the man that she was going to walk down this rocky granite hillside to a lake that was maybe 300-400 yards away and take pictures. Well, the people saw the man. He never moved. Stacy walked down the hillside. She was never seen again. A huge, huge search that lasted weeks found the lens cap to her camera inside the periphery of a wooded zone around the lake, and Stacy was never found. So that was one of the first cases I went after pretty hard, named the date, the location, the person. This time I get a call from an agent, a special agent from the National Park Service Police named you. Why you? Calls me up the same thing. Why do you want this case? I said, well, it doesn't really matter, but I just want it for some research. He says, well, you're never going to get the case. I said, well, why is that? And he said, well, it's irrelevant, but you're never going to get it. I said, well, then why would you talk to me like that? First of all, I probably have 15 other cases at this point from other national parks on missing people, so why would you stand in the way of this? He goes, no, you don't. I said, what do you mean, no, I don't? He says, you don't have other cases from other national parks? I go, yeah, I do. And he goes, well, then they must have been found. I said, no, they were never found. And I said, another question is, why isn't she in the national database for missing and exploited children? And he said, she is in there. I go, no, she's not. Yes, she is. You're lying. He called me a liar a couple times. It wasn't a good conversation. And he eventually said, you're never going to see this case, so you might as well just give up. And to this point, 5 years later, he's correct. Of all the cases I've named in national parks, I've gotten a lot if I name the specific case and date. Sometimes they claim that they're national archives and they don't have them anymore, even though the person's still missing. Other times they just say, well, we can't find them, but most of the time I get them. And if at this point, if you kind of follow the pattern of the national parks, okay, so I have an attorney call me, I have a special agent call me, and they're standing in the way of a missing persons case. You told me when I talked to them that it's just classified as a missing person, there's no suspect, there's no criminal involvement, and the case hasn't been picked up in 14 years.
Dave Paulides, before we leave the subject about your interaction with these federal agencies, tell me, what was the cost estimate they gave you? If you're going to get these records, it's going to cost you how much?
So for just Yosemite, it was $34,000, and if I wanted it from their entire system, $1.4 million.
So they clearly did not want to give you this stuff. I mean, they were going to come up with one reason or another, and they still haven't done it.
Correct.
What happens, say somebody disappears in Yosemite, which is you identify in your missing 411 book, you say that's one of the main clusters, maybe the main cluster. Somebody disappears. They do post something on their website for at least a couple of days or something, right, with information about the case?
Yeah, and it goes back to what those rangers said at the beginning, is that there's that 7 to 10 day cycle where there's information available, there's a lot of publicity, there's a lot of kind of a show of force, as you'd say, and then after that, there's no follow-up, there's nothing. That's it.
You've had some recent interaction, almost like whistleblowers coming through and sending you information, and you shared some of those with me. I don't know how much detail you want to get into, but what are the things that those folks are telling you about how it works on the inside?
Well, that's a fascinating part of it that is slowly coming about, I guess, as the news comes out that we're listening and we have some other evidence, is that in the past I ran into, by pure accident with a friend of mine, a special agent that was retired from the National Park Service, one of the people I really wanted to get to. And we ended up having a long conversation, and I asked him, why would the Park Service be taking this position? And he went on to explain that he was actually investigating a superintendent from the parks for some major theft, and he was told by his superiors, shut it down. And he goes, Dave, I had him cold left to right, and I was told to drop it. And he says, it's a total lack of integrity. Those were his words. He goes, from top to bottom, a total lack of integrity.
You had a letter from one guy who, I guess he was a former Park Service guy who was telling you about how it was also shut down. A FOIA requests were shut down. He said it was the only time that it had happened in the 40 years he worked there where they did not respond to a FOIA request.
That's correct.
Remember the details of that?
Well, there's actually been 3 or 4 of those. One of them, a husband and wife worked at a national park together as rangers, and they thought that there was something strange going on with the budget in the park. So as private citizens, they filed a Freedom of Information Act request to get a hold of the budgets that they had questions about. And they wouldn't give them up. And they appealed, and they lost. And the next thing you knew, they were out of a job.
I've also seen these most recent communications you've had with the agencies, the on-the-record stuff, U.S. Forest Service, for example, as you're asking them. Summarize those, because they're about as frustrating as the Park Service stuff.
Yeah, I had always heard unofficially from the U.S. National Forest Service that they didn't keep track of missing people. And I thought, okay, I want them on the record telling me A or nay. So I filed a formal request, and initially one of the FOI people for them came back and said, I don't think we have anything. I talked to one of our law enforcement authorities, and they said, we don't have anything like that. So I said, okay, can I have the name of the law enforcement authority? And then they came back with a formal letter signed by an individual inside their system saying, no, they have no list of missing people, period. And what's interesting about that is that, like the National Park Service, they have a branch of the U.S. Forest Service that are law enforcement officers. Their job, just like all police officers, investigate, look for, and keep track of. But apparently they don't either.
Do you think that those lists do exist, that in some deep, dark vault somewhere that they do keep the lists? Or now do you think that they have dispersed the information, if they ever had a list, that they got rid of it in case you get lucky and get a hold of it?
Well, as another good journalist I know said, if they don't have it, they're idiots. If they do have it and they're keeping it from me, that's against the law. So either way, they should all be fired.
Let's go over the characteristics, the laundry list of characteristics that tie your cases together, the ones that you have described in the first 3 Missing 411 books. And the reason we're doing it, of course, is because these come up again in the cases we're about to talk about.
So one of the first things that's surprising to many people is that when they bring canines, bloodhounds in to track the missing person, that canine sometimes walks in circles, sometimes they lay down, sometimes they walk up the trail 5 feet, come back and look at the handler. And as somebody who worked around tracking canines for many years in law enforcement, I can tell you that those dogs live for the hunt. And they're excited, and when they do something like that, that means there is nothing there. And on the cases that we work with, about 95% of them, the dogs do exactly that. There's no scent to be found. They don't want to work. There's nothing there. There's a water relationship to a vast majority of the cases I worked in national parks and forests. There's a geographical clustering effect. And at the beginning, first 3 years, we're not even looking for this. And then afterwards, we thought, seems like there's a lot of people missing from Yosemite and a lot of people missing from Sequoia. And maybe we ought to just put a pin map up and put the locations. And we did, and we almost fell over. And as time went on, there were 52 clusters of missing people in North America. And yes, there are people missing outside those cluster zones, but the vast majority fall into those clusters. And those clusters run up and down the east and west coast through the Rocky Mountains. There's essentially none right down north to south in the middle of the United States. And there's clusters all the way around the Great Lakes. And that's where I say it comes back to water.
And these are not people that some of them go wandering off by themselves, but sometimes they disappear amid a group of people. There's kids playing right under the watchful eyes of their parents, and then boom, mom turns around and the kid is gone, and they never find him.
There was a reporter for the Huffington Post a couple years ago that wrote an article, and the title of it was "Don't Be Last in Line." And he had read my books, and he understood that there's a first-in-line, last-in-line concept with this. First in line, last in line, in a group of people where people don't have you in sight, for some reason you disappear. A lot of times you're not found. Now, one of those other profile points that I talked about a lot in the last 2 books is intelligence. And it seems that at both ends of that intellectual spectrum, there's a large amount of disappearances. Some people that have dementia or autism or some very debilitating disease, those people tend to disappear a lot and are never found. On the opposite end of that scale, you have physicists, physicians, academic types that disappear and are never found. And this isn't something that's happened just in the last 10 years. You can go all the way back many, many decades, and this has been going on.
You know what it's like, Dave, and I'm sure it's occurred to you. It's like fishing, like something is out there fishing, and we're the fish. And sometimes, they catch one and they toss it back. And sometimes they just put it back in the water, and sometimes they toss it up on shore and just disregard it. And sometimes they keep the fish. It seems to be that something lives there and fishes humans in those cluster areas, that it lives there.
I'll even give you a different analogy along the same lines as my son. We were talking about this one day, and he goes, "Dad, you know what this is like? This is like you go to the arcade, and you look at that claw machine. And you look at the games and the toys down below, and you kind of have an idea what you want to go after. You put the claw over it, and you drop right on it sometimes, and you get the one you want. You pick it up, and you move it away, and you're not dragging it, but you're picking it way up. You keep it for a while, and then you drop it out, and you throw it out another entry point." I thought, wow, that's pretty good.
Mm-hmm. Well, needless to say, you need whistleblowers, insiders, maybe retired National Park Service rangers and investigators, U.S. Forest Service folks, their family members who might have talked about this. You're looking for sources. So, folks, if if you're listening and you have that kind of information, if you know what goes on inside these agencies, what they're hiding, how they hide it, Dave wants to hear from you. We want to hear from you. Is there a relationship between the clusters and just the fact that those are the parks that are most popular?
I don't think so. There's some really, really big national parks, and there aren't a lot of disappearances there. But the biggest ones, Yosemite, Great Smoky Mountain National Park, Crater Lake National Park, Rocky Mountain National Park. But then again, there's some like Bryce Canyon, Grand Canyon. There's hardly any.
You and I talked years ago when your first Missing 411 book came out, and I sort of offhandedly talked about it maybe leading toward urban cases, that eventually the research would lead you there. And you weren't quite sure. Maybe you thought it would happen. Let's talk about the transition from the rural cases to urban. What got you started on that?
I got to give you some credit, George. I mean, you're a smart guy. You keep your eyes and your ears open, and sometimes when you get into research like this, you get maybe a tunnel vision on just the national forests and parks. And after we had that conversation, I thought, he's right. I've got to keep more of an open mind. I didn't really want to go into that city area because it's easy for people to say, oh, you know what, that's a human abduction, or, oh, you know what, he's just trying to force this to tie into something. Whereas in national parks and forests, there's no, you're not going to get a human abduction on a trail. And in all my years, I've never heard of one. For that reason, maybe it was easier to enter that arena without getting a lot of flack because there isn't much to be had. Now, going into the city, I thought, okay, I agree, there's probably some of this going on, but I actually was, after we talked, I was reading a lot of different material, and I was reading about a series of young men. All of them were described as college, super smart, athletic. Some of the articles said these are the smartest and the best of the best out there, and they disappeared. And they were later found under some unusual circumstances, all in the same sort of area. And right away I started thinking, okay, so all these guys are super smart, the best athletes, described as best of the best, kind of fits one end of that intellectual paradigm that I've been writing about. So I said, okay, I'm going to start looking at this. And right away, when I got into the minutia of a few of these cases, I realized, wow, canines weren't finding a scent. There's a direct water relationship. There was a clustering effect after I looked at about 50, kind of how it all came about.
So it is your entry point. These particular cases that we're going to talk about in the next hour, it's your entry point to looking at urban cases in general because of the characteristics that tie these together. But it's tough. It's tough because, as you mentioned, there's so many other possibilities. Somebody disappears in a city. First of all, nobody gives it a whole lot of attention, maybe the person's family or something, but there can be so many other reasons why you can disappear. You disappear in a forest, there's only a certain number of things that could have happened to you. But city, it becomes really complicated.
It does. And because of that, I was real cautious in this book. I wanted to look at medical evidence, and there was a lot. I wanted to look at victim statements. There was a lot. Parental opinions. There was a lot. And there were even some newspaper people that jumped on board and thought, wow, what's happening here is unusual. And like I said, I spent maybe 15, 16 months doing the research on this book. And darn, if there isn't, many of the disappearances in this book are in the same areas the disappearances from the first 4 books are in. Around water, a clustering effect. I mean, it's right there.
The book or report that you had read by these other investigators, who were they? And can you tell us a little bit more about that? What jumped out at you and grabbed your attention in reading that?
So there was a professor named D. Lee Gilbertson and a retired New York City detective named Kevin Gannon. And they wrote this book called Case Studies in Drowning Forensics. That's really probably what got me into it. And they talked a lot about a few cases. And it reads just like a textbook. It's the size of a textbook, and it's pretty expensive. Great reading. These guys did a phenomenal job. One thing that I think hurt them is that they were looking, just like I was looking at parks and forests, they were looking just at these type of cases. And they didn't have the ability to look at the entire spectrum of the U.S. like I had already looked at. And one of the other big mistakes is one of these people at the beginning started to make an association between some graffiti that was found around some of these sites, and it wasn't found at all the sites, and they tried to make an association that certain people were doing this. But when you look at the history behind it, the number of countries involved, it's impossible that it's one person. It's impossible that it's a gang of people.
Is there an equivalent to the Park Service in other countries that agencies elsewhere internationally that might have lists of missing people in their jurisdictions?
Funny you ask that, because somebody in Canada decided to file a Freedom of Information Act in Canada because their Freedom of Information Act only applies to their citizens. So we could file one in Canada and they could just ignore it and it's no big deal. Well, somebody filed one in Canada with the parks, I forgot what they call it up there, but they're equal to the National Park System. They came back and said, too, we don't have any lists of missing people. Even though I've written a lot about Canada, a lot about missing people up there. And again, it just mimics exactly what's happening down here.
In a moment, David Paulides joins us again. This work, Missing 411, The Devil's in the Detail. More incredible stories of people simply vanishing. And, David, we've got more cases. This one of a missing firefighter. This has got to be as strange as any of them, David.
Yeah, George. It kind of fits that profile that we've been looking at for the last 5 years, and certain elements at this early stage of the search seem to point towards it fitting that specific workup that we do.
Tell us what we know about Mike Herdman, the missing firefighter.
So he went hiking up in the Los Padres National Forest in an area called the Sespe Wilderness on June 13th with a fellow firefighter, paramedic from Arcadia. Mike's a married man, father, has a small daughter. He has a lot of experience in the woods. The guy he was with didn't have a lot of experience, but they hiked far in to the wilderness, started to set up camp. Mike brought his dog with him, and just as they were setting up camp, Mike was wearing a pair of shorts and a shirt, and that's it. And for some reason, his dog just took off straight into the woods. Well, the individual that Mike was with saw Mike take off running into the woods for the dog named Duke. And that was the last that Tyler Byers, the other firefighter, ever saw of Mike Herdman. And Tyler stuck around, called for Mike during the night, yelled for him throughout the night, eventually gave up and decided to hike out the next day, which was an all-day deal. So by the time that search and rescue finally got on it, it was probably a day and a half into the disappearance. Now, what's interesting is that in the last 5 years, we've been doing research into the missing people in the woods scenario. And a couple of things about this are exactly on key for what we found. Okay. Namely, a lot of people disappear with a dog or chasing a dog into the wilderness. And this is exactly what happened to Mike. Second part of that scenario is when people disappear, when they're found without shoes or other pieces of clothing. Well, Mike disappeared with no shoes. And
now, did he have shoes on when he went running into the woods?
No.
He did not. Okay.
Which is kind of strange. I mean, you think maybe you'd take a 10, 20 seconds, just throw your
shoes on. Put your shoes on, yeah.
But no, he didn't. Now, right after this happened, I got an email from someone and said, do you understand the area that Mike disappeared in? And I got to be honest, at the beginning I didn't. And they sent me to a website, and the name of my latest book is Missing 411, The Devil's in the Detail. The website they sent me to was developed in 2011 and hasn't been touched, and it's about the Sespe Wilderness and the condor sanctuary that's in the wilderness. And darn if the name of that website isn't The Devil's in the Detail.
Oh, my God.
I was floored. And the reason the guy came up with that is because there are so many devil names, geographical locations inside this area. There's an area called Devil's Heart Peak, which is in the center of the Sespe Wilderness, right near the Condor Sanctuary. There's another place called the Devil's Gateway, another place called the Devil's Potrero. And in my books, the reason I named my book that is because a lot of people over the last 5 years that we've done research on have disappeared in those geographical areas where there's devil in the name.
Now, this gets stranger, David, by the minute.
I tell you, the people that I'm around, that I talk to every day, that I work with, we look each other in the eye sometimes and can't believe what we found.
Okay, so in Herdman's case, he goes running into the woods, chasing his dog, doesn't have any shoes on. How far do you go into the woods before you say, you know what, folks, this is futile. I'm not going to continue chasing my dog. I'll wait for him to come back. I'm going back to my camp. You don't keep going. He apparently did, or something happened.
Well, there's a lot of people that sent me emails that said, well, we think he fell as he ran into the woods, and maybe he broke his leg and he can't get out. And I explained that Tyler Byers took the search crew into the location where Mike disappeared. And there's been 200 people searching for a week in a grid pattern out of that area. And if Mike did break his leg, he can still yell for help. That's
right.
Number one.
Right.
Number two, they got permission from the Forest Service to throw drones up into the sky, along with some helicopters with FLIR that are looking for a specific heat pattern from people.
Thermal imaging.
Correct. And they haven't come up with any images. Now, one thing that everyone was looking for was his dog, Duke. And searchers had seen him during that week running around, but they couldn't get him. And then on Sunday, June 22nd, 9 days after he disappeared, Duke showed up at the trailhead where Mike's car was originally parked.
So he did come back.
He came back.
Did they catch him?
They got him.
Without Mike?
No Mike. And they said that he looked a little weathered, a little beaten up just from the elements, and they were going to take him in and give him some injections or something and try to get him going, but the dog did not appear like it wanted to go back into the woods.
Like it was petrified?
They didn't use those words, but they said it wasn't in condition enough to go back in.
You know, I know, David, talking to you, that you don't want to speculate on cases like this, but there's got to be a point where even you have to come up with some theory yourself, correct?
Well, and you bring up a good point, and everyone that I work with is constantly hammered about this. And let's go back 5 years. When we first started to do this, after the first year of just compiling cases and looking at 1,500 missing persons cases like this, we really didn't have a good grasp on much, other than a few things started to fall out. And that being, it was pretty obvious that people were being found without certain pieces of clothing or without shoes. A few cases started to show up where they were missing in these areas with hell or demon or devil in the name. And at the end of that first year, I got that same response. You know what's going on, and you just don't want to say. And I can tell you that there are reviews right now on Amazon for my latest book from a couple of people that said specifically, if you thought that you knew what was happening after the first 3 or 4 books, wait till you read this book, and you'll have a drastic paradigm shift. Because in this latest book, we keep going with the elements that we've discovered in the other books, but we gradually transition until you realize that this just isn't a land-based phenomena. And a lot of people thought it had to be a land-based creature, entity, or something. That's not it. But I tell everybody, you better read at least one other of the Missing 411 books before you read this latest one. Otherwise, the statistics and the data that we gathered, you won't be able to appreciate it because it won't make so much sense to you.
Now, let's talk about Herdman for a second. I mean, realistically, and this is conjecture on your part, but if a guy goes chasing his dog, I mean, really, David, how far is he going to go? Is he going to go, a couple hundred feet, a football length away? He's not going to keep going into the woods, is he?
Well, like I said, George, earlier, if it was me, I'm not going at all into the woods. I'm going to wait another 10 or 20 seconds until I can just throw my shoes on.
Yeah, absolutely. But, his decision was, I'm going right now. Boom. Off he goes. But, I mean, you don't keep going. And let's assume something had attacked him for some reason. Don't you think his colleague would have been close enough to have heard that echoing scream throughout the woods?
Absolutely.
That never happened.
Now, in many of the books, we write about cases where parents say, my child was right behind me and disappeared.
Poof, gone.
Gone. And if you hear it once or twice, you think, well, maybe the parents are just trying to rationalize it away, make the story sound a little better, make them feel better as parents. But we've heard this dozens and dozens of times. And you're not going to hear a scream. You're not going to hear something like this. I mean, we've documented 1,200 cases now, and many of them occur just like that.
Are they falling into portals or other dimensions, as far-fetched as that may seem?
You know, I'm not somebody that's going to say no to anything at this point, because there's something about this phenomena that's real, that we've documented through factual cases, that very few people have ever denied. And Herdman's case, we've gotten hundreds of emails saying, you know, you got to be aware of this, you got to be following this, and we are. And I got to say, up to this point, it fits exactly into what we've written about in the past.
Of those who disappear, how many are found alive? What percent?
Maybe 35.
35% are found alive. And do they say similar things, or are most of those cases what one would call natural disappearances, and they just got lost and they got found?
So part of that profile has to do with a large group of these people that disappear or also have disabilities. Namely, maybe they have autism, maybe they have some kind of congenital older person's disease. Maybe they disappear so young they can't even talk. And when they're found, they can't explain what happened. And of the people that do disappear that are able to talk, the vast, vast majority of them don't remember anything. In the last 18 months, we've named Mount Rainier National Park as one of the 58 clusters of missing people in North America through our research.
Are they always with somebody, or are they alone?
You know, initially, they're with someone. And then for some reason or another, they get ahead of them on the trail, or they're behind them on the trail, or they get distracted in some means. There's not one common way, but it almost appears as though there's some segment of opportunity that comes forward, and it's in that brief moment of opportunity that something bad happens. These things don't happen back to back to back in a specific area. Otherwise, everyone would take notice of it. These are always separated by 8, 9 years minimum, sometimes 15 or 20 years. So you go from 97 to August 8, 2005, Anita Mayo was a resident of Hawthorne, Nevada. She was a licensed practical nurse working at Mount Grant Hospital. And she was driving over into California to visit some relatives. She was driving a 97 Mercury Sable station wagon, and she pulled into Strawberry, and she bought some trinkets in the store. And after she left Strawberry, she drove out to the Vista, and apparently, from what everyone can find, the only thing that was missing was her camera and her keys. Her purse, let me correct that. Her camera was missing. That was the only thing.
The camera.
The doors were locked. Caltrans people found the car. The purse, the keys, the cell phone were in the car. And her prescription glasses, they also said, were missing.
Maybe she took a picture of whatever.
And you know, George, this is another subgroup that we've talked about in the books, and that is photographers. People that go missing in the woods carrying a camera with specific intent to take pictures. They vanish. Nita vanished, and they took the car as evidence. They've never had one clue as to what happened to this woman. And I wrote that up in one of the books. Now, fast forward 9 years. Patty Sue Albright, 46 years old, she owned a restaurant in Sonora, well known in the community. She's going to go take a hike in Kennedy Meadows, she told some people. For some reason or another, she turned into Donnell Vista Lookout in her Toyota 4Runner. The sunroof was open, and they found the car with the roof open. Apparently it had rained, and the keys to the car were gone. Her purse was inside the car, and she was nowhere to be found. Giant search of that surrounding area. She's never been found.
Gosh, just doesn't make any sense.
As I've stated before, whatever is doing this does it with 100% effectiveness.
And it's fast and it's silent, apparently.
Exactly. And they've never made a mistake, because if they had made a mistake, you or I would have heard about it.
Somebody would have. There would be some evidence, some pathology, something would find something. These forensics, they're too good these days.
So I'll tell you a story that came into us about 2 years ago. Is a person was hunting up in Colorado, and he said he was trucking along a trail, hunting, was trying to get to a location, so was moving kind of fast. And he said he saw something ahead of him that almost looked like you were looking in a warped mirror that wasn't real clear. And he goes, I slowed down almost to a crawl, and I approached this. And he says, I swear to you, I put 1 foot forward as I was stopped, and I lost sight of my foot, but I could see part of my leg, almost like you're putting it into a wall.
Wow.
He says, I pulled my foot back through and started to back away because whatever it was not good.
That is amazing. Kind of reminds me of the Twilight Zone episode, Little Girl Lost, when she fell out of her bed, basically, and wandered into another dimension, and her father had to go in there to get her. And it was like a whole new world. It does sound far-fetched, David, but you know what? I don't think we can rule out any of this.
I agree with you.
You got to tell me which way you're tipping now. Tell me.
Well, again, a lot of people thought at the beginning that I had it nailed just because it happened in the woods.
Mm-hmm.
But as you move forward, and if you're a researcher and you stick with the profile that's established, but you keep an open mind.
You've changed, right.
Well, there's the best example is there were 3 guys that were fishing off the coast of Florida, and they happened to be jockeys, really, really good jockeys, that were going to be in the Kentucky Derby and Belmont in a couple months. And they were fishing in a small skiff that was being watched by a big yacht. Immediately, as they get in position in water that's only 2 or 3 feet deep, a storm comes in. Part of the profile, there's bad weather associated with these disappearances. And a storm comes in to the point where they get washed away from this boat into a small little cove. Make a long story short, this boat goes in as far as it can. Not only were the 3 guys never found, none of their equipment was ever found, and it was in one of the biggest searches ever in Florida at that point.
Weird. Like they were taken.
Well, the author of the article, one of the articles we read, said these guys could have just gotten out of the boat and walked ashore.
But they didn't.
No, it was a small island, and they were never found.
Somebody's taken these. Something is being... They're going into another dimension. They're being beamed aboard a ship. Something's happening, David.
There is no doubt in my mind that something extremely unusual is happening to these people.
I remember my first reaction when you told me the general topic, and I thought to myself, well, gosh, yeah, people disappear in the wilderness, in parks, in forests. They get lost. They fall off a cliff. They get eaten by bears. What's so unusual about that? Walk us through some of the steps about the kind of characteristics that separate these cases from just a normal kind of a disappearance.
After reading thousands of missing persons cases, certain elements start to come out at you, and they hit you in the face. Time after time, you read the same thing, and you start to say, how could this be? It's almost like it's a mimic of the other 4 cases in the same state. A lot of times, the people disappear with a canine. Many times, if they disappear overnight, bad weather comes into the area, rain, snow, etc. If people are found, many times they're found in a creek bed or riverbed. Other times, if they're found, they're missing clothing or shoes. If they're found, an older person, they can't or they don't want to remember what happened. Other times, it's a disabled person to the point where they can't speak, so they can't communicate what happened. Or it's a very young child, and they can't speak at all. Berries, swamps, and boulder fields are 3 of the predominant things that keep coming up with missing people from the East Coast and the West Coast. And again, it's that clustering aspect. If you went up through the middle of Northern California all the way to the Canadian border, that route of the Cascades has more people missing under unusual circumstances than I can ever tell you. And it has more clusters of missing people up through that area than any place else I can imagine.
Dave, I want to spend a few more minutes sort of recapping for those who have heard this before and don't remember it, and for those who haven't heard it, why these cases are so weird. There are a couple of characteristics that really jump out at you. One is about where the kids, particularly kids, how far away they're found. Talk about that.
That's one of the most unusual aspects to this. And when we first got into this, we read just about every search and rescue manual you could find. And when professionals go out into the field, they set up grid patterns to search for people. And it's based upon the topography you're in, based upon the age and the health of the person you're searching for. And for a child, say, under 8 years old, they're usually found within 2 miles 90% of the time, usually within the first 4 to 6 hours. Well, in the Western book that I wrote, I described a kid named David Allen Scott who was 2 years old. And I usually stop at this point when I'm talking to an audience and I say, how many people in the room have children? And I say, think back to when your child was 2 years old. How far could that child walk without dropping from exhaustion? And how fast could they move? How quickly could they get out of your sight? Well, David was with his family vacationing at a place called Mono Village, kind of on the eastern side of the Sierras, down near a city called Bishop. And he disappeared from his family as he was down near a lake, and everyone initially thought he went into the lake. Make a long story short, they searched everywhere. They finally brought in some soldiers, and for some reason they started going uphill. And they didn't go a little uphill, they went way uphill. And when you look at the valley that David disappeared in, there's a trail that almost goes straight uphill in a zigzag fashion up this mountain. They went over the top of that mountain, down into another valley, back up another mountain, total 3,000 feet, and they found him behind a boulder. They tried to interview the soldier that found him, and they asked him if he had any injuries, and the soldier said no comment. I thought that was interesting. But one of the stories in the new book involves a boy named Clarence Murphy, and he was vacationing in the Central Sierras in a place called Camp Sacramento, which is at about 6,000 feet. It's a place where families go to take their kids. It's right next to the American River.
Yeah, that's a weird case. That's a spooky one.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
And Clarence was vacationing with his mom. He was in a sandbox at the camp, and his mom just stepped away for a couple minutes. And she came back, and he wasn't in the sandbox. And they had a conversation, and he said he would stay there. And they searched. Initially, all the searchers usually go to the river, or they go to the lake, and they search hard there, and that's usually where kids ended up being found. But in the cases here, that's not where they're found. That's not where they go. And Clarence did the same thing that David did. And whether it was against his will or with his will or whatever, he went uphill again. And I can tell you, as an adult, when you're at 6,000 feet and you have a choice between going uphill or downhill, you're going to go downhill because it takes the wind out of you at that elevation. And initially, they searched for 2 weeks. They never found him. And they searched hard. They pulled out everything they could to find this boy. Well, fast forward from April 14th, 41, 14 months later to September 22nd, 42, there was a deer hunter that was up a ridgeline 2,000 feet uphill, 2 miles from where Clarence disappeared, and he saw a shoe on the ground. But he was in an area that would remind you a lot of Yosemite because there's a place there called Lover's Leap. I've been in this area many times. It's filled with just huge pieces of granite boulder fields. It's a hell-forsaken place, great place for deer hunting. And this hunter was on his horse, and I think that's probably the only reason he was there because it's so rugged.
Another weird aspect is the inability of dogs to follow a scent. I think that was true in the Clarence case in that Camp Sacramento.
Absolutely. They brought up multiple canines. In fact, in every story in my books, the canines failed to pick up a scent that eventually finds the victim. Sometimes they go a ways down the trail, and then they lay down and they don't want to search, or there's no more scent. This past summer, I was asked to talk at the largest group of search and rescue professionals in the world in Lake Tahoe. It's called NASR, National Association of Search and Rescue Professionals. I gave them the 50 cents edition because I only had an hour in front of them, but I gave them the outline of what we're doing and what the canines do. There was a line out the door of these guys wanting to talk about the same things that they'd experienced, but they thought they were just so isolated and unique. And I've been around canines before in the police department when we searched, and these dogs just live for the search. For a search dog to just lay down at that time or not want to track, these searchers that had the canines, they said it's one of two things. Either there's no scent there, or it's extreme fear on the dog's side for some reason that we can't comprehend.
I know in the previous volumes you had instances where clothes were found folded up or laid out as if in a ritualistic fashion. And I know in the new book you've got a case, I'm trying to remember what it was, but it's an elderly lady who was found wearing different clothes from when she disappeared.
Yeah, that's an interesting case from Central California. A woman disappeared from, she's a very wealthy lady. She disappeared from her kind of a rural ranch. And there was a lot of suspicion that the family was involved and a lot of inner griping going on and finger pointing, etc. But they didn't find her for months and months. And then somebody said that they thought this lady picking berries off a berry bush in this remote location near Lake Berryessa. And she was eventually found wearing overalls, like men's overalls, and shoes, where she was for the previous 2 months, how she survived, where she got the clothes. There were a million unanswered questions with that case, but in many ways it mimicked other elements that we see in these cases, so that's why it was included.
I would like you to address for a moment the questions that are buzzing through people's heads. That is, why isn't it a bear or a mountain lion? Why couldn't it be drug smugglers or hermits or mountain men living out there that are abducting people and taking them away somewhere?
And those are the first places everybody goes when they first hear me speak. And I like to say that when we're speaking here on the phone, you're hearing probably less than 1% of the entire story. And so I really don't want anyone to go any place in their mind that can reconcile these thoughts, because once you read the books, I've yet to find anybody that'll say, hey, this is just bogus. Everyone reads these, and they will see that there's a commonality here of elements in each of the cases. Now, one of the things about animal attacks is that if somebody is attacked, usually you have time to scream. You have time to make noise. And if it's an adult, you're usually going to fight for your life. And that fight is going to result in a huge disturbance on the ground, and dogs and canines are easily going to pick up that scent and track that down. The reality is that in all of these cases, animal attacks have been excluded. And they haven't been excluded by me. They've been excluded by search and rescue or by the law enforcement agency that's doing the case.
Same thing for people, say drug smugglers out in the national forests. I mean, dogs could follow that scent as well if they were responsible.
Oh, for sure. And, the last thing that somebody who has a meth lab or somebody who's growing weed, the last thing they want to do is do something that's going to bring any law enforcement to the scene. They don't want to cause any disturbance. They don't want to do anything that's going to bring any awareness to what's going on there. Think about that. And if it's an adult and they're going to try to take you, where are you going to go? And it goes back to, well, the canine's going to be able to track you as well. And it's going to be able to track scent, marijuana grow there. The flyovers they're just going to be in the area to such an immense degree. They're going to find it, and it's going to be revealed.
Boy, and it has to be frustrating for these lawmen to be out there, often with so many resources, with hundreds of people searching, to go through an area almost arm in arm and not be able to find something, and then have the missing person appear in an area that they'd walked over 40, 50 or more times.
And I think the public sometimes gets numb to disappearances.
We're back with Dave Paulides talking about the case of Todd Geib, and this case really gets creepy, Dave.
So, catch you up is a massive search. Todd isn't being found. Canines aren't finding a scent. Helicopters aren't seeing anything from the skies. All the swamps were searched. All the lakes in the area were searched. Nothing's found. His residence is on west side of a place called Half Moon Lake, kind of on the correct side as the party. Party was on the west side of the road as well. And as the searchers are going, there's one small body of water on the west side as well, and it's called Ovid Hall Lake. It's about 1,000 feet long, and it's narrow. It had been looked at many, many times. It's not easily acceptable. Some locals fish it. You can't drive to it, and you have to walk to it, and it's a tough walk. It's in the exact opposite direction of where Todd needed to go from the party to his house. Well, people did fish the lake from May 17th to May 18th afterwards, and they were using a fish finder, and they combed the lake from top to bottom, left to right. There was nothing in the lake. The people were interviewed multiple times. On July 2nd at 5 p.m., a husband and wife were walking down to the lake, and they saw what they described as something really odd protruding from the water. This is July 2nd. There's no ice. It's a warm Michigan day. They walk down, and it's Todd's body. And the witnesses said in the reports that he was floating like a bobber. Todd's hat, his cell phone, and one shoe were missing. He was totally gone for 21 days. His location absolutely shocked everyone because it was on that opposite direction that he should have been going. The on-scene coroner classified in his report the case as suspicious, which is never done unless there's a crime involved. The coroner couldn't find any rigor mortis in the body. There was no ice in the lake. He couldn't determine if any lividity was present at all. And again, you always find lividity in bodies, except in these cases. Decomposition was classified as intermediate to moderate. He had the hair still on his head, and there was swelling around his eyelids. They couldn't determine the color of his iris. That's the colored portion of your eye. Now, when Gannon and Gilbertson looked at this case, they described his body as being pristine for being in the water 21 days. His blood alcohol level came back at 0.12%, just a little over the legal limit for driving. A toxicology showed that he had what's called contanine. It's a byproduct of smoking. But highly unusual is they found something called despermine. It's a depression medication. Todd wasn't on depression medication. He wasn't taking any drugs. He was a very level-headed guy. They also found something called amitriptyline in his system. And again, he didn't take drugs. They couldn't believe that they found this stuff. They couldn't determine the cause of death. It was listed as undetermined how he died, even though drowning was a possibility. They didn't find any water in his lungs. It's another case where the parents reach out to Dr. Cyril Wecht. He reviewed the case. He said that Todd had to have been unconscious when he entered the water. The photos of the body were taken to a medical examiner's conference, and it was the unanimous opinion of all the medical examiners that looked at the pictures is that the body wasn't in the water for 20-plus days. The opinion was that Todd was out of the water 15 to 18 days, placed in the water. And the family tried to get the Michigan police to change the cause of death. They wouldn't look at it. They wouldn't have anything to do with it. Now, everyone needs to understand something. Police departments, cities, counties, they work off of statistics. And most police chiefs want to keep that homicide statistic down because it's bad for business. And again, I'm going to present you with facts, not opinions, about what's going on. The fact is, Todd wasn't in that water for that entire period of time.
There are quotes that you have in the book from the guy's family, obviously pretty upset about the determination that the officials say it's not a homicide. How can it not be a homicide? You say he's a big guy. He died on land. Somebody had to drag him, carry him, toss him into that water.
Well, and the other part of this that people can't forget is the positioning of the body that's being found in these cases, completely outside the bounds of what's normal. What's causing the bodies to end up in this position? Nobody knows. But something unusual, highly unusual, is happening. And yes, the parents say things But, George, in every one of these cases, the parents are saying, there's no way this is my son. There's no way this happened. He knew this area like his backyard. He's not going to be walking in the other direction. But it's irrelevant. He didn't go the other direction. It's proven through scientific forensics. Todd Geib and these other people that we've talked about were not in the water the entire time. Now, in my previous books, I write about these victims being found in areas that were previously searched. It goes back to the claw machine I talked about in the arcade. They're dropped into an area, they're placed into an area somehow where they guaranteed weren't in the area before. When they're found, if they're found alive, they're found in this semi-conscious or unconscious state. I think the mind of most would go right to that, well, there's a criminal element, you slipped something in the drink. But you got to remember something. The canines, there's no tracks leaving the area. The canines, there's no scent leaving the area. So even if somebody would have picked Todd up and carried him out of the area, chances are trackers, etc., would have tracked him out of the area. They would have found his scent someplace else. But then again, he wasn't in the water the entire time. So that means he was held. Nobody, I don't care who you are, in 125 cases leaves no evidence behind. And really, there's no evidence behind of who's doing this or what's happening.
Whoever's doing it is pretty good at it.
I would say perfect. Now, in my previous books, I've written time and time again about the FBI. And the FBI are the best in the world at documentation. I don't care what you say; these guys and ladies are the best. And they could go and they could sit and they monitor a case. They don't get involved, but they just sit and watch and they listen and they write. And these reports go back to their profiling unit for review and classification. And they're the best at profiling. They're the best at accumulating data. And in my past books, I've said that the FBI continually are on scene at some of these crimes, and they're writing, and they are not idiots. They know what I know, and I'm sure for a fact they know 10,000 times more. But they seem to show up. The Shane Montgomery case, to me, is a turning point for the FBI involvement, because from the time Shane went missing, the FBI was on the scene. And just not the FBI agents themselves, the FBI abduction task force agents were there, yet there was no evidence of a crime. November 27, 2014 is when Shane, 21 years old, Philadelphia, PA. He was a graduate of a Roman Catholic high school. I'll stop there again. You're going to continually hear me say that the majority of these people that disappeared have some strong religious affiliations. Shane did. Graduated from a Roman Catholic high school and was attending Westchester University in Philly. On November 26th, he was at his cousin's house, and both decided they were going to go to a bar and have some drinks. At about 1:15 a.m., Shane sent a text to his cousin saying he was in the bar but couldn't locate his cousin. At 1:28, he called another friend and said, "Do you know where my cousin's at?" Got no answer, couldn't find him. At 1:45, he bumped into something in the restaurant, and he was told that it's near 2 a.m., you guys got to leave. People said there was no way he was staggering drunk. He left the bar and was never seen again. He didn't show up for a family event on November 27th, late in the day, and the family reported him as a missing person. From the first day Philadelphia police started working this event, the FBI was there interviewing staff at the bar at Cadell's Pub. This is the first time I've ever seen the FBI there interviewing staff on an incident where there was no evidence of a crime, and Philadelphia police said there was no evidence of a crime. They were just investigating. Well, the FBI doesn't investigate missing people. Now, they did locate a closed-circuit television footage of Shane crossing between a pub and a parking lot over a small footbridge of a canal. The footbridge passed over what was called Manayunk Canal, which paralleled the Schuylkill River. Shortly after he disappeared, the parents convinced Garden State Underwater Recovery Team to come in and start searching the water for their son, because there was really no other place for him to go in their mind. And the first break came on December 21st. Now, that was almost 3 weeks after he disappeared. this team is so good, they found Shane's keys in the river. Not in the canal they saw him walking over, but in the river. And that to me is just unbelievable they found the keys. And the search was initially focused on that canal, but when they cleared it, they moved to the river. Now, what's fascinating about this is that one of the detectives on the case was interviewed by a news team, and he was standing next to the river and they were talking about Shane, and he said, well, if Shane's in the river, he's miles downstream at this point because the river's flowing so fast. And they said, oh, okay, and they interviewed him about some other stuff. Well, the same underwater recovery team that found his keys in 10 feet of water continued to look, and they looked behind a variety of locations in the area he was in. Well, days later, almost a month after he disappeared, they found his body in an exact location right behind where he was seen in an area that had been searched many times behind a brewery. And this was in the exact location where he was seen on CCTV. Now, how did he end up in the river behind the brewery in a location that had been searched many times when the detective said there's no way he'd be anywhere near there, it'd be washed all downstream? That was funny. That didn't make any sense. And the family said that the coroner told them that the cause of death was accident, but they never stated exactly what caused the death. The body was assisted and reported and investigated by not only the FBI but local Philadelphia authorities. And as of last week, the coroner and the medical examiner have never released the report on the cause of death nor the blood alcohol level.
Are you encouraged by this interest by the FBI? I mean, I guess you want the best detectives in the world, the best bloodhounds on the case looking at this. But then you have to wonder, well, maybe they know a lot more than you do, and they probably do know a lot more than you do, but would they ever release it, as, you know, other government agencies have been reluctant to do?
Well, I've filed Freedom of Information Acts against the FBI before in cases, and you get a redacted document that one word out of every 20 is readable and everything else is blacked out, so you never really get anything. So in one sense, I think, well, yeah, they're there. But what's interesting about this is back when I was a cop, there was a girl who disappeared in Petaluma, California, named Polly Kloss. And the FBI were pulled, and they all flew in the next day, and they worked this case with Polly Kloss. One of the abduction task force agents knew one of our guys and said, yeah, pick yourself and one other guy and come up here. And I was the other guy. And these abduction task force guys, they are the best of the best. I often tell people, you know, the average FBI agent probably doesn't put his handcuffs on a person once a year. They are all ex-cops. They are really on top of things. If I ever had a family member disappeared, these are the guys I want looking into it because they are great. And yeah, it in a way it makes me feel better, but in another way I know that whatever they find we'll never know because they'll never say, they won't even tell the other police officers working cases next to them what they know sometimes.
I can't remember if the FBI ever showed up in any of those National Park Service, National Forest missing persons cases, disappearances. Is there any hint that they are involved in any of those?
Oh, yeah. In fact, in Missing 411 Eastern U.S., I wrote about an entire series of disappearances that occurred in the Great Smoky Mountains. And there was one specific FBI agent that was assigned to follow these strange disappearances of people in the woods. And I forgot how many times, but it was a lot of times. It was the same agent, the same name, time after time. And all he would say is, we're monitoring the case, we're monitoring the case. Well, when I interviewed one of the victims' dads, Dennis Martin, and I asked him, I said, well, what is there about this case that I don't know? Because I think I probably know everything in print. He says, you know that FBI agent that worked all the cases here? I go, yeah, his last name was Reich. He says, exactly. He goes, do you ever know what happened to Agent Reich? I said, no. He says, he committed suicide.
I want to go back to the Todd Geib case before we get to these other two really weird ones, because there was something I wanted to ask you about that I overlooked, and that was, you mentioned he made 4 phone calls from what he described as some kind of a field. Were those two all different people?
So this is an important point because first one was to a friend, and then the other calls weren't made public who they made them to, but there's an entire series of these that I write about in the book where right before the person disappears, and I mean right before, they're on the phone or they're calling somebody, and then at that point, they're separated from the conversation somehow. And sometimes the people get out a sentence. Sometimes they'll say something like, "Oh my God, where are you?" It's like your last words you ever hear from the person, and then they're not found.
One of those, I don't remember which case it was, but you said the guy had dialed 911 and the call lasted 1 second, and then poof, it's dead.
And sometimes if you drop a phone on the ground, it will automatically dial 911 sometimes. Other times, maybe it was them actually looking for help. I don't know.
In the Todd Geib thing, you mentioned something I didn't remember from the book, but I thought that the witnesses said it was the sound of either heavy breathing or wind. What made me think of is Todd flying through the air.
George, you're not the first guy to think that. There were probably 25 of these books that went out as review copies, and I got probably 5 or 6 of those type of responses. And it's hard not to go there right away. I try not to, but I think there could be something to that.
Let's go to Stephen Kubacki. I've been saving this one, and I hope I didn't oversell it too much, but this just really blew my mind. And take it away.
So Stephen, 23 years old at the time, February 19th, 78, another February disappearance, this time in Holland, Michigan. And it's interesting that we're talking about Todd Geib. Holland is just north of Casnovia, also in an area where there's been these clusters of strange disappearances. And also, Stephen, again, was strong religious ties. He was going to Hope College, which is part of the Reformed Church of America. This location that he was at is 30 miles north of South Haven, 76 miles south of Ludington and Baldwin, the cluster area I was telling you about. In February of 78, Stephen was attending Hope, and this is the part that's going to sound strange again. He was trying to get a degree in German. On February 19th, Todd told his roommates he was going to go cross-country skiing along Lake Michigan near Saugatuck, and when he didn't return, they filed a missing persons report. The Michigan State Police led the search, and they pulled out every stop imaginable. The Coast Guard on Lake Michigan went out, tracking dogs, helicopters, foot patrols, and the state police found his skis and his poles on the beach of Lake Michigan, and they saw footprints on the ice leading out 200 yards out onto the lake. And they flew over it, and the footprints just appeared to stop. And they thought at the time that because it had been a couple days that maybe he had just fallen through the ice and because there were no tracks coming back. And another report stated that they found his backpack in the same general area. So he was essentially separated from everything he had and apparently walked out on the ice. And the determination that after a couple weeks searches, police wrote down that they believed he died and drowned on the lake. Now, fast forward to May 5th, 79. This all occurred February 19th, 78. So, you're looking at about 15 months later. Stephen says he woke up in a field on a Saturday night, 40 miles from his father's house in Deerfield, Massachusetts. John Kubacki was his dad. 53-year-old father told in interviews, he goes, "I thought my son was dead." And he said that he walked up to the door and said that he doesn't remember a lot. He woke up in Pittsfield, said he was lying in a meadow, and he was wearing clothes that weren't his. Now, this is 700 miles east of Lake Michigan, almost in a straight line. Now, in 1983, Stephen went back out and got an MA in linguistics from Ohio University, and in 92, he went back to the University of New Mexico and got a PhD in clinical psychology. I tracked him down into Washington. I called, tried to make a contact with him, told the receptionist I wanted to talk to him, sent him a personal email that I wanted to talk to him. He would never respond. And what's important about this, he's a missing student. He's missing in an area that is quoted as the Great Lakes Triangle, and I talk about this in my book. That is a great book that talks about a series of disappearances in and around the water of people, planes, and boats that are as unusual as the disappearances I talk about in my book. Stephen's missing time and space, and reporters asked him if he'd ever see a psychiatrist, and he said no, because I don't have any problems.
So he had to have been interviewed by police, his family. Hey, where you been? What did he say?
I wish I knew, because in all of the articles I pulled on this, it never said that the police took an interest in it, never said that, because if you think about it, there was no crime that occurred. Remember, anybody can disappear, and it's not a crime. Now, there's some pretty strong evidence that there was factual evidence. He walked out on the ice right directly from where his skis and things were. So where was he for 15 months? He says he wakes up in a field wearing somebody else's clothes. He said that there was other things in a small satchel that was next to him that were maps and things that weren't his, and he doesn't know where it came from.
Stephen, this guy we're talking about, he's gone for 14 months. I mean, couldn't he have just, I guess he wandered off, had a girlfriend he didn't want to tell the family about. He ended up living with her, and then he pretends he has amnesia, and he comes back. Suppose?
Again, anything is possible, but I think that the reality of the facts that presented themselves would say no, that wouldn't be true. And unless Stephen was a very well-read guy back in 1979 and knew about the clothing, the wrong clothing, the ill-fitting clothing, how would he know that this fits into other scenarios that I've written about? How would he know that this area of Michigan has had a whole series of disappearances that are equally strange to his? I mean, the parallels to other things are just phenomenal.
Missing 411. And it's an amazing story of how people are simply vanishing, disappearing, gone. Now, you will hear David on this program. He's not going to speculate. He does not guess. And he's not going to reveal his thoughts on what he thinks is happening to these people. You're going to draw your own conclusions. But it's always a pleasure to have you on the program, David. Sometimes I can't sleep after I've interviewed you. You got me all riled up with this stuff.
Well, George, that makes two of us. I mean, there's many nights where I'll go through a case and I'll go lay in bed and just gather my thoughts. And sometimes my thoughts are out there with the people in the woods that have disappeared, and it's not a comforting feeling.
Oh, my gosh, it really is. By the way, a couple months ago, I had a great opportunity to interview David for our Beyond Belief television program, and he is as riveting on the radio and on television as in person, and David, just great information.
Well, George, you're very kind, but the truth of the matter is that you're probably one of the most polite people in the public spectrum I've met in a long time, and it was an honor to be on your show, and I appreciated the invitation.
So what is new in the field of these missing people?
Well, about 2 or 3 years ago, when I was in the middle of investigating rural disappearances, several people came to me and they said, I know that you're one of those people out there that keeps an open mind and you keeps your spectrum open, but one of these days you're going to move from the woods, those rural areas, and you're going to come into the city because the profile points that you've identified on these cases, they're going to transition. You are just going to find it. It's just going to be a matter of time. Truth of the matter is I was so occupied with looking at people who have disappeared in the national parks and forests in North America that I was probably a bit taken by that statement, and I kept my mind open, and some things came along, and some people sent me some emails, and sooner or later I got to the point where I was looking at cases of college-aged men that disappeared under unusual conditions, predominantly in the Great Lakes region, but also along the East Coast area of the U.S. And there were some common denominators there that also reflected upon the disappearances we were looking at in rural areas. And after studying that for a year, a few months back, I came out with a 5th book called Missing 411, A Sobering Coincidence. And the factors on that is that canines can't track the people to where they disappeared. They almost seem to disappear under the noses of their friends and family, and many, many times they're found in an area that had been searched sometimes 10 times. And this is the same profile points that happen in the rural disappearances.
Just amazing.
Now, one of the weird things is that many times when these people are found, the search and rescue people are never thinking criminal act. They're always thinking, my gosh, we found somebody, whether they're dead or alive, we found them and we can get closure. And they're not trained investigators, and usually when they're found, the body's turned over to the coroner. Yeah, they died in the woods, and that would be the end of it. Now, with cases in the water, it brings home an entirely different perspective on the way the body reacts to water, and there's certain things the body does in certain periods of time in the water that it doesn't do on land, and they're readily identifiable. And after looking at a series of cases where there were secondary autopsies, and in some cases where the original medical examiner was honest and would face the consequences, say the person disappeared 7 days ago, the coroner would come out and say, well, they might have disappeared 7 days ago, but they've only been in the water for 2 days.
Huh.
And, George, this doesn't happen once or twice. This has happened many times.
Over and over again, too.
And then, on top of that, many times the coroner comes back and says, yeah, we can't determine what caused the death of these people. And this has happened also in these rural disappearances. And when you try to stay confined to certain points that you've identified and you don't want to wander, then it excludes a lot of perimeter cases that we might have looked at, but the reality of it is that we're trying to stay to that straight criteria. Now, some other detectives were working on something similar to this, and they used the cases and they identified them as the smiley face killers. And they claimed that in certain instances they would find some graffiti next to the site where the people were found. And these guys, a guy named Gannon, he was retired from New York police, I give the guy a lot of credit because most detectives don't want to work missing persons cases. They want to work homicide cases, robbery, homicide, etc.
Right.
But I tell you, Gannon from New York, he really paid attention to what was happening to these people in the Hudson River and in other rivers around that New York area. And he determined that certain bodies couldn't have ended up in locations where they did. He worked with coroners to figure out that the bodies weren't in the rivers as long as they were. And these guys were looking at it from a local area perspective. And when I looked at it, I knew that I had cases in rural areas that were not only in the United States and Canada, but they were also in 7 other countries that exactly met this established profile. Well, I knew that if the profile went to these young men that were disappearing in these rivers, then it also probably was happening in other areas of the world.
Jeez. What about the cases that are happening around British Columbia, Canada, where feet are showing up on shore? Just feet. They're not finding bodies, but feet.
You know, we looked at that because in the part of the profile points that we've identified is that people are missing shoes and clothing many times when they disappear. And then we started looking at these feet, and some of them have been found on the Northern California coast, and some have been found on lakes and things in North America and in British Columbia. Now, there's an entire series of these in the Vancouver area where they haven't been able to identify anybody. And they've got DNA, and they have the shoe, and they have the foot, but they can't really talk much more about it because some coroners have claimed that the foot comes off first if they're in the water a long period of time, but they should be able to put that foot with a missing person if they have the DNA.
You would think so. My God. Somebody would report, hey, my son's missing, my friend, whatever.
Right. Exactly. And you bring up the point about British Columbia, and I get questions all the time from Canada, and I know that there's a lot of people from there listening right now. And the area of lower British Columbia, in that northern Vancouver area, there are so many people that have disappeared. And I've got a couple friends that live in that area, and they tell me all the time, hey, there's people disappearing up here. And the news does the same thing here as they do in the States. They report it for the first couple days, maybe up to 4 or 5 days, but then you never hear about it.
Then they stop. Then they go on to the next tragedy.
Exactly. And why are these people disappearing? How are they disappearing? And if they're found, what are the circumstances? And you really don't hear a lot about it. 99% of the time, these people are hiking alone. They get ahead of the group. They're behind the group. One way or another, they aren't seen when they disappear, and they're usually found in areas that baffle the investigators. And it doesn't matter if it's a Canadian or a U.S. search and rescue person. Sometimes when they get on the media, they're stumped. They can't answer the question how the person got to where they were found.
And let me ask you this, David, of what's the percent of those people who disappear who are found dead?
So in this profile that we've established, that's really the only one I can talk to, is I would say it's probably 30-40%,
all right,
maybe slightly higher. But then the people that are found, the uniform issue with them is they don't know how they got missing. They don't remember how they went missing. They can't explain where they were. It's like a very unusual memory loss.
All right, of that percent, 30 to 40%, maybe a little higher, that are found dead, then what's the percent of those who are found alive? And again, they don't remember or anything like that, but what's that percent? Found alive.
Found alive, I would say probably 50, 55, maybe 60%.
That high, okay. So there's a percent, though, that we just don't know where they are, right?
Very high percentage, yes. Of that 40% that are left, I would say those that are gone, maybe 10 to 15% we can't find.
Totally vanished.
And George, I'm not talking about some small effort to find this group. There is enormous effort to find them. We're talking about FLIR in the sky. We're talking about multiple canine, blood-sniffing bloodhounds. We're talking about sometimes people walking shoulder to shoulder. And we're talking about covering the area multiple times.
Yeah, one person sends you an email from North Carolina, James. He said, of these people who are found, do they still have blood in their bodies? Interesting question. I never asked you that.
So there are a few unusual cases. It's called exsanguination, where some bodies are found and there's no blood in them. And I've written about that in some of my books. And it's really unusual. It's not a common trait. And in my last book, I wrote about a woman that disappeared, and that they had that issue, and they couldn't find enough blood to do tests on her in the body. And the unusual part of that is that they couldn't find any wounds on the body that would account for the loss of blood.
Almost like they're vampire people out there.
Yeah, except that you would think with a vampire-type incident there'd be marks or something.
Or something.
There never is on these.
Now, in the book series, we've got, 4 different books, Missing 411?
5.
5 now. Okay. And what's the latest on your movie documentary?
So we just got back about a week ago after a lengthy trip up through Idaho, Washington, Oregon, and back down through northern Colorado, where we did an entire series of interviews, and it was phenomenal. And I can tell you that I'm really critical of the interviews, and if they aren't going well or if the information isn't good, I'm one that's going to speak up and say, hey, this is crap.
That's true. You don't hold back.
But the reality is that some of the people we found to interview, George, just came to the plate. And
beautiful.
Sometimes the cases that I wrote about where we went out to find and interview victims, sometimes the story is even stranger after you get into the minutia of the data than it was when I originally wrote about it. And we've got some pretty big-name people that some others out there in the world are going to recognize in the movie that stepped up and wanted to participate with us that are experts. And then we have some county sheriffs in some areas that absolutely confirm the strangeness of some of the cases that I've written about. So I think right now we're doing really well. We should be finished filming by the end of December. It'll then go to editing, and that could take months. So I tell people don't expect anything before September, October.
Okay. And initially, David, these were all around the park systems. Have you started looking at, cities where people have disappeared to?
We're staying with that disappearance of college-aged men that have disappeared in a city environment. that fit a profile. And we can talk more about that later, but
Okay.
the reality of it is it's really exact. It's college-age, educated young men. Most of them are big-time athletes. Most of them are on scholarships for either academics or athletics. We're talking about the cream of the crop young men that have vanished.
That's right. And what about race? Does that matter?
Predominantly white males, and I've stated in my past books, and it's staying continuous here, German descent.
Now, how in the heck, if someone is taking them, I'm just saying if, how would they know their nationality?
That's the part.
That's weird.
It's truly baffling. I don't know what to say.
I mean, would somebody have access to their dossier or something? That's strange.
Well, when you get into it, you realize that it can't be something normal. This has to be something so far outside the bounds of what you and I and everyone else understands, because these young men are so smart, so athletic, so easygoing sometimes.
Top of the line.
Yes, exactly. There aren't any vagrants that I've written about that have stumbled into the river and drowned. These are unknown circumstances of how they got in the river that baffled the cops.
Are they generally spotted by somebody an hour or two before they disappear?
Sometimes, but again, that time of the disappearance, they don't know, because a lot of times the person, in many instances, they're in a bar drinking with friends, and their friends say, all of a sudden, we lost contact with him. We don't know where he went. We texted him, we phoned him, and it was like under their noses the person disappeared.
Like a guy said, I'm going to go to the restroom, and maybe he does, maybe he doesn't, but he never comes back.
Exactly.
Jeez. Unbelievable. David, I'm going to go through some cases with you and have you update us on some people with basically a list of these people. But this is shocking. This isn't getting solved, is it?
Well, you know what I tell people is when I give a presentation, to me it's like spokes in a wheel. And I started off with just one or two spokes. This missing young men in urban areas. Mm-hmm. This is another spoke in the wheel. And I've got a feeling the spokes are going to increase before we really solve this.
And when the inner city disappearances, what percent of those are found dead?
99%.
Oh my God.
Yeah, it's a very scary, high profile. There's only one case I know of where somebody disappeared and was found alive.
All right, we'll talk about that too. Then we'll talk about those people disappearing in cities, and like David said, 99+% are found dead. And David, those books are still available, are they not?
Yes, and I warn people not to buy them on Amazon because there's resellers out there that are just ripping people off. But on our website, they're $24.95, canammissing.com.
You know, that's a good point because I've seen some books that would sell retail for $19.95 and they're on Amazon for like $100. Crazy.
It's nuts. And every once in a while I'll get an email from somebody saying, why are you charging so much? And it's not me.
Not you. No, not you at all. Let me go through some names of missing people, and you can give us updates or tell us the story behind them, okay?
Sure.
Neville Jewell from British Columbia.
So this kind of brings on a story about a very experienced hiker. He's on the Howcrest Trail near Cypress Mountain in northern Vancouver area. Parked his car on this trail, started walking. He texted his girlfriend at 2 o'clock, said he was going to be home on time. He was in the West Lyon area. Didn't show up, didn't come back. They started a search right away. They pulled his cell phone forensics, and it kind of was showing some activity in a specific area, in a specific ridge line of in the Capilano watershed. And for people who have been to northern Vancouver before, there's a famous Capilano suspension bridge, and that's in this area. They brought search dogs in. They never found a scent. Bad weather hit the area immediately after the search started. Another profile point. The other profile point being is that when canines can't find a scent in an area for the victim, that's something we pay attention to. Make a long story short, this happened September 12, 2015. They gave up the search, and Neville Jewell has never been found.
Never been found. So that's one of those percents. Poof,
right.
He's gone.
Right.
Sending texts to his girlfriend, and he's gone.
And I think that, for the people who are listening to me for the first time, one of the vetting points that we do is that we take out the commonalities of, well, is it an animal attack? No, search and rescue eliminates that. It's not an animal attack. Could there be human predation in the area? Well, there's no evidence that a crime's ever occurred in this area before. So is it easy to disappear in the wilderness? Well, maybe if you wanted to, but the people here that we're talking about, no mental illness issues, in happy relationships, non-suicidal. If they were suicidal, if there was sign of human predation, if there was sign of animal predation, that would eliminate it from our research.
Next up, Tom Billings. Tell us about Tom.
This is another tough one, 22 years old, in the same area as Neville. Trail runners said that they saw Billings just before he started to hike in the area of Lynn Canyon in the same general area. Well, scent dogs that were brought up into that area, they found nothing, even though the searchers had people that put him in a specific place. After that, they found nothing. This is in an area of Grouse Mountain, again in that Capilano area. He left his cell phone in his room because it was broken. He left his room at 9 a.m. that morning, telling roommates he'd be back by 9:45 that night. He discussed hiking this area of Grouse Mountain with his roommate. He was an extremely experienced hiker, and he had made big trips to Russia, Siberia, Belarus, Latvia, Israel. It's a lengthy list. This guy was well known in the hiking circles, and it was confusing to friends and his father why he had tried to leave and make a hike on a mountain when he finally started at that base at about 2 p.m. He knew better than to do this, so it was confusing to him why he did. And a massive, massive search was inhibited by bad weather, and it was also inhibited by the fact they never found a scent in the area where they knew he was going to be. So we have two hikers now that have disappeared in the same area with the same profile points. Both have never been found.
How did these stories come to you? Do people share them now? Insiders?
It's unbelievable now, after doing this for a number of years, how many emails I get from people saying, you really ought to look at this area, or you really ought to look at this case. And I will tell people, because it's funny, they hear you and I having a conversation, and maybe they've listened to 3 or 4 of our interviews, and they think that they understand what is happening here. And I can tell you that in all the interviews I've ever done, maybe 4 or 5% of all the facts and elements have come out in these 100 hours of interviews. But all the minutia of the facts is in the books, and that's really the meat of the issue.
That's right.
It's these little things where, like you said, he left his cell phone in his room. In a lot of the cases that we write about, the people didn't have any transmission with them. They didn't have a sat phone. They didn't have a cell phone. They didn't have an emergency transponder beacon that we tell people to carry. And for whatever reason, it seems to be more the norm than not.
Yet so many people are disappearing from these parks. I know some people now who have not, just because of listening to us, they have not gone on a park trip camping outing or anything like that. They've said, I'm not going.
Well, and I get this all the time. When you make an appearance, people come up to you and they ask you a million questions, and they say, well, I've decided not to take my family here. And the reality is that I tell people, you should go. But just be cognizant that this isn't the safe haven that many have made the forest and the woods out to be, because it's unbelievable how quickly, especially a small child, can disappear even though you think they are in their presence, in the immediate presence of you. And then there's also, I think there's a macho-ness to some men about going into the woods and being able to survive. Yet I know dozens and dozens of cases of hunters that have gone into the woods and they've never come out. And I know that if they would have had an emergency transponder beacon with them, they would have lived.
They would have lived. That's right. David Koch, tell me his story.
Well, this one's a tough one. 36 years old. He disappeared May 25th, 2005. In the exact, and I'm talking the exact same area that Tom Billings disappeared 8 years later. He was an associate publisher and sales manager for a magazine called DM Review. It's an IT magazine. He's on a business trip to Vancouver, had a wife, and had talked about going up to Vancouver and being able to take these outdoor trips because he was an enthusiast of the outdoors. He took a trip to Grouse Mountain. He told his wife he was going there, and he was on one of the last trams to go up to the top of the mountain. It was about 7:30, 8 o'clock. He rode up there with 25 other people. It was all on videotape. He was wearing sandals, a T-shirt, and shorts. It was beautiful weather. And when he got to the top, showed him getting off the tram, and he walked over towards an atrium for a couple minutes, caught him on CCTV going back to the visitor's booth and or to the bathroom. Within a couple of minutes, the TV didn't see him anymore, and he disappeared. Everything at that top of that mountain was open until 10 o'clock, and it was normal for people to go up there at that hours after work. Immediately after David disappears, the weather changes. The headlines for the paper in Canada were, "Weather hinders search for Heartland man missing in Canada."
That happens a lot, too, doesn't it? The weather just quickly changes.
Exactly. And they looked for him intensively for 10 days. 400 rescuers, multiple helicopters with FLIR, multiple bloodhound teams, in addition to hundreds of volunteer searchers. And it stated that it rained almost nonstop for the next 5 days from the time he disappeared. Now, fast forward, and he disappears on May 25th. June 7th, in an area 2,100 feet off of one of the trails on the mountain, in a pool of water, they found him deceased. Now, that area had been searched multiple times, and the searchers said they were confused that he was found there. Now, this is the part, and it goes back to the missing men who had been drinking in and were found in rivers. This is one of those cases that it's a dead-on match. The autopsy said that he died of hypothermia, but the medical examiner stated he went missing on May 25th, but Mr. Koch died 6 days later on May 31st. So where was he?
Where did he go for those days?
And end up right in the area in the middle of searching. Now, just for food for thought, he was also of German heritage. Things to think about. Where he was found was not where he perished, number one. There were no tracks going in and out of that area. Searchers specifically stated they found no broken branches, no clothing or threads of clothing in the area that they had searched and where he was found. And they said that this was the largest search in 10 years in that area.
It's almost as if, David, they go through some kind of dimension or some kind of door, and they come back later as if they find their way back in. It's weird.
A lot of people have told me that exact thing, George. Or some people use the word portal.
Yeah.
And other people have said, but you know what's confusing is that what were they doing during the days that they were missing and alive?
Exactly. If anything.
Yeah.
Were they suspended in some kind of animation? Who knows?
Well, what I'd be interested in, but many times the medical examiner won't release this part of the autopsy, is I'm interested in what were the stomach contents that they found.
Mm-hmm. Good point. Good point. And you've had stories of people who have had somebody walking in a group, maybe the last person, and then they turn around and he's gone.
Well, there was a story written in the Huffington Post about my books, and they called the title of the story was Last in Line, and subtitle was Don't Be Last in Line. And that was, it should have really been, don't be last in line, don't be first in line, and always stay within close proximity to the people you're hiking with. Because it seemed as though that once you got out of view and out of sound range, or just around a corner, something happens and these people vanish.
The German connection with so many of these people being of German descent, is that new? Did you just uncover that, or has that been ongoing?
You know, it might be that maybe I'm a slow learner and it comes to me slower than some, but after a while, when you start seeing the same sort of names, and when descent of a person is talked about in an obituary, German comes up more than normal. A man named Morgan Heimer, 22 years old, was a tour guide in a group of people along the Colorado River in Grand Canyon National Park. They were a couple days into their trip, and they pulled to the side 2 large boats of people, and they take this side trip up this creek. And the people go way up the creek, maybe a mile or so with their guides, and there's a big pool and a waterfall, and they kind of hang out. And the creek's not even deep enough to drown in, per se. You know, you could walk across it ankle deep. But Heimer was in the back of the line when they were coming back on this creek excursion. He was wearing a life preserver, and he disappeared. And Morgan was a student at the University of Wyoming, and I can tell you that this shook up this tour group immensely. Somebody in that group heard about our work, and he called me and he talked to me extensively about this and said, Dave, there was no place for Morgan to go. If he fell in the creek, he wasn't going anywhere. The sides of that canyon were straight up and down. And he was walking, and he was within a quarter mile of both boats and 50 people, or not 50, 30 people when he was walking. And nobody can believe he didn't make it back because they all thought he was right behind them. So they brought in a huge amount of searchers from the National Park Service, volunteers from the tour group. They searched that area for a week. They didn't find one trace of Morgan Heimer. Again, German descent.
Baffling. I mean, what does law enforcement tell you, David? And I'm sure it's not confidential. What do they think's going on?
Well, when I gave that talk in front of NASA in 2012, and I gave the talk just like I'm talking to you now, I wasn't holding anything back. And at the end of it, there were 3 Alaska State Troopers there, and Alaska State Troopers are in charge of all search and rescue in Alaska. And one in their group stood up and he said, Dave, you're saying something that everybody in this group, that if they've been involved in search and rescue for a long period of time, they know is truthful. But nobody wants to talk about it. Nobody wants to admit it's happening. And they want to analyze it away as just, well, that's unfortunate, or the dogs didn't want to search, or the person must have done something stupid to disappear. But he said, you know what? There's something else here, and people are going to have to wake up and listen to what you're saying. At the end of the talk, there was a line out the door of these searchers that want to tell their story of unusual things that people don't want to talk about.
You know, you would think that if law enforcement and government agencies were told about a threat that has resulted in hundreds of deaths, hundreds of disappearances dating back decades, maybe centuries, that it's been happening over much of the world but is concentrated in particular epicenters, clusters, if you will, you'd think that officials would be interested in that. Please tell us more, they might say. What could be causing this, they might ask. You'd think. But in reality, government agencies and law enforcement have seen the evidence for themselves. They've been told about this. They know something is going on, something weird and dangerous, and the response has been a big fat zero, silence. And worse than silence, they've stonewalled efforts by private citizens to get to the bottom of this, going so far as to issue veiled threats and to throw up roadblocks to investigations. Let's start this way. Did you know, or did you guess back when you started down this road, that you'd still be chasing the mystery years later, that you still would not have any solid answers, that it would take you this far and this deep?
I think during that initial phase, maybe the first 2 or 3 weeks, no. But then after we started to get responses from the National Park Service about not having lists of missing people, not wanting to give up lists of missing people, and wanting to charge exorbitant amounts for those lists if they had to put them together, things started to seem peculiar at that stage.
Let's get into the response, because I think the response, or lack thereof, from the agencies, the various agencies, is almost as interesting as the phenomena itself. Let's talk about before we get into describing the parameters of the mystery. How the latest kind of roadblocks that have been thrown in your path.
Well, there's a couple of women that disappeared at Crater of the Moon National Monument in Idaho earlier last year, and during that, while they were missing, they walked out into the area together. They both went missing together. They had little dogs in their truck. Their family members said they'd never go out for a deep hike. They'd always stay within eyesight of the trucks, et cetera, et cetera. Well, one lady was found after a week. The other lady wasn't found for over a month. And at that point, we filed Freedom of Information Act requests against the Park Service for information about the disappearance, details about the search, and since they now had the bodies, information about what was the cause of death. And they stonewalled this for 7 months. And then they sent us the documents about a month ago and essentially gave us nothing. They stated that they weren't the lead investigating agency, even though it's on their property. They stated that they didn't write any reports other than a brief face sheet about the initial disappearance. That's it. They stated that if we want anything else, we had to go to that county jurisdiction because they didn't have anything. And then they stated something that we've never heard before, and we don't think it has legal precedent, and that is that they withheld photos of the crime scene and of various evidence, saying that they wanted to protect the privacy of the relatives. They knew that they have no standing on protecting the privacy of a deceased person, but that's the first time we've ever heard them make a claim that they're trying to protect the privacy of loved ones.
You think they know that you're one guy, that you have limited resources, that you're not going to hire some high-powered lawyer to come after them, and they just are going to get away with dragging their feet as much as they can?
Some people I know from technology have come to me who know about what's going on, and I've heard the same thing on the internet and via Facebook, et cetera, from people saying that we should start a Kickstarter campaign to get the $1.4 million to force them to cough up the list.
$1.4 million. My gosh.
They say that they don't have a list of missing people, and they say my books aren't in enough libraries to qualify for an author's exemption, but if I give them $1.4 million, they'll come up with the list.
Just off the top of my head, I think you could do it for less if you hired a really high-powered lawyer who deals with Freedom of Information Act stuff and sick them on them. Because this can't be legal. It can't be right.
It doesn't seem like it. It doesn't have that feel-good effect. And I don't think that's what freedom of information was initially brought about for.
You've had wildly varying estimates, right? When you've had them where they've complied with a request, give you boxes of information at a low cost, and then they tell you some outrageous figure for what would seem to be a much smaller file.
It seems as though that certain files they'll readily give up, even on their own people. There's an individual, a ranger named Paul Fugate, who disappeared in Arizona while he was on duty, and they gave us a box full of documents for $40. It's still an ongoing case. There's some accusation that there's criminal element. Maybe he was abducted criminally, but they just gave us that. Other times, they said, you'll never get a case when we ask for it. There's specifically a Stacy Arras case out of Yosemite. By the way, Yosemite, the biggest cluster of missing people in the world that fit our profile. For the Stacy Arras case, they said we'd never get it. I asked why, and they said, you just never get it.
You know, this idea that the National Park Service does not keep a list, of missing people in say, Yosemite, it boggles the mind. It makes no sense.
A friend of mine and I were up at a national park doing some more research, and we were at a little satellite office for this park, and we saw this group of 4 older gentlemen sitting there talking, and you could tell that they really knew what they were talking about the Park Service. And I kind of got the feeling that one of the guys was either a retired law enforcement man with the Park Service or current law enforcement. I just kind of waited my turn until he walked out into the parking lot, and I walked up to him, and we introduced ourselves, and I said, hey, if you have a minute, can I talk to you? He says, absolutely. He was the nicest person you'd ever want to meet. Turns out that he was a retired special agent for the Park Service. And I told him what I had encountered, the books I'd written. I said, why is the Park Service, why did they take this position? And he says, Dave, it's a lack of integrity. Those were his words exactly. And he said they should be giving it up, but they don't. He goes, I could tell you about many cases I worked where there were things that were very wrong, and they just dropped the ball, or they compromised themselves, or they did something that was unethical. And he says it's just flagrant.
You've made the point, Dave, in your book that it would be pretty easy to keep this kind of a list. It's not like some gargantuan task.
I think maybe I said this on one of your shows last time, is that our group, the Can-Am Missing Project, will go out and purchase 183 clipboards for the National Park Service with a binder full of graph paper for each one of those. And we'll mail them to each one of those 183 locations. And we'll have that paper divided up by date, name, location, time, disposition, and this is going to be your list of missing people. And at the end of every month, when various parks send in their monthly report to headquarters, if there's a new missing person, then you just send it in with your monthly report. And somebody with a $500 laptop could keep this list at headquarters. This isn't rocket science. This is very easy to do. I was doing some research in a national park on some other type of deal, and I was talking to some concessionaires in the park, and I kind of knew at the time that the National Park Service personnel wouldn't talk to you, but the people running the stores and things inside the park aren't employees of the Park Service, and they would talk. And I was having some success, and I noticed that during the days, a couple of people were watching me. It's no big deal. They kind of knew that would happen. That night, I was staying at a place off the Park Service property. I get a knock on the door, and there's a couple people standing there, and they said, "Hey, Dave, we're off duty, but we're National Park Service Rangers, and we have a story we want to tell you, and we know who you are, and you're a good investigator, and we just want to give you some info." Kind of leery at the beginning, but they came in. Both of them were really nice people, and they stated that over the years that they had worked at several different national parks, and they had seen a series of disappearances at each of their locations over the years. And at the front end, there was a lot of publicity. There's a lot of activity. That first 7 to 10 days, there's a lot of interest and a lot of news coverage. And after that, it's over. And when they say it's over, it's over. There's really no follow-up. There's really very few other searches. It's like it goes into this hole and it's gone. And it had them concerned because they thought that there was an inordinate amount of missing people at their parks, and they thought that there were certain circumstances inside them that they couldn't identify, but they said it just felt wrong. And they said that rarely would they find somebody, and if they did, they were in places that they shouldn't have been and didn't make sense. So I said thanks. I listened, asked a few more questions, and after a couple hours they left. And the next day I was driving away, and I called a couple of law enforcement guys, and I said, "Hey, pull up these locations and see if you see anything unusual or you see many disappearances." And right away the response was, "Wow, there is something here." And that's kind of the way it got started.
I guess it would be hard. I mean, from the vantage point of all the work you've done now, from this vantage point, you can see the broad patterns. But I guess without the benefit of all the work you've done, unless you're a Park Service ranger and you see them for year after year, it would be really hard to spot this.
It's really hard. And in the other books, I've explained that at the back of each book, I usually have an index of all the missing people. And I tell people to look at that index and look at the dates and the locations. And there's almost a hopscotch effect on the missing people. There aren't a lot in one location within a short period of time because that would really raise awareness. But if you have one, say, in Yellowstone, and you have another in Great Smoky Mountains, and you have another in the Adirondacks, and they're all about 3 or 4 or 5 days apart, it's not going to raise a lot of suspicion.
And that's what it looks like, is that you'll have the same general location, but they'll wait a couple of years. Whatever it is, it will pick them off in the same spot, but they'll wait for things to settle down.
Correct.
Is there what are the patterns? Talk about the clusters a little bit.
So the biggest cluster in the world is Yosemite. And in the books, I identify that boulders, granite, there's something about being in a boulder field or being around granite that can be dangerous. And a lot of people disappear in those areas. And Yosemite has so many strange disappearances. in 3 of my books. It's just unbelievable. In one of the books, I wrote about 2 University of California graduate students that disappeared in the late 1950s, 3 months apart. They didn't know each other. They were brilliant guys. One was vacationing with a family. The other was working there during the summer. They disappeared under very unusual circumstances. Somehow or another, and I don't know how, the families found each other. They didn't know each other in school. They didn't have the same major. Everything about them was different, except they were grad students from Cal. The families found each other, and they wrote letters to Eisenhower asking him to send in special forces to search for these 2. Well, about 2 weeks ago, from the Eisenhower Library, I got 28 pages of documents about this. And it's very fascinating because one thing became clear is that the Army didn't want anything to do with this. And in fact, they lied in internal documents to the White House saying that they thought that these guys both got picked up on the road and taken out of the park and there was nothing to it. But they never said that to the press, and they never said that to the parents, the best I could tell.
So initially, Yosemite being the biggest cluster, but you started out noticing 28. How many do you think there are now? There's
58 in North America.
Give me a list.
The unusual part about it, just in the last year, when we started to map the missing people, the Great Lakes comes out right away as almost the entire circumference of the lake at almost even geographical locations. There's a cluster of missing people. And so when you look at the map, what comes out at you is mountains and water. There's clusters in mountains, and there's clusters in water, around water.
After Yosemite, what's the most prominent cluster?
Well, that's a tough one. I would say maybe Colorado or maybe one of the clusters in Washington or anywhere through the Cascades. They're all about even after you leave Yosemite, but it's very much far and away the largest.
How many does it take to qualify as a cluster? How many cases? 4, 5, 6?
Yeah, if three will do it if they're all within that profile and they're all geographically close, and I'm saying within 70 to 80 miles.
For the benefit of those who've heard you before and the benefit of those not familiar with this, let's go down the laundry list of characteristics. What qualifies to count as your kind of a case? What characteristics?
First of all, rural location, no mental illness of the subject or the victim, no water-related death or suspicion of drowning, no criminal suspects in the case. One thing we found just in the last year as well, this has come out and it's very troubling, is that there's people of extremely high intellect that are disappearing, and then there's people with disabilities and very low intellect that are disappearing. People like me, we're in that middle. We're not disappearing at as high a rates. Canines are involved in 2 different levels. That a lot of people disappear with their dog, and there's a lot of people that disappear and they bring canines, tracking dogs, bloodhounds to the scene, and they can never pick up a scent. 99.5% of the time, they can't pick up a scent, or they are unwilling to track, or they're afraid. And it's hard to say what of those 3 it is, but it probably is that there's no scent.
I think that's one of the weirdest aspects. You've told me a couple of the stories. Maybe you can share a typical one where a dog just acts really weird for a dog that lives to track. I mean, that's what they do.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, they're so excited to get out there on the trail and start doing their job. I can't even tell you how excited they get. And there have been times where the dog gets brought to the trailhead. They're given the victim's scent. The dog walks in a circle and lays down at the handler's feet. They've never seen the dog act like this before, and they can't explain it. Other times, the dog will get there, it'll walk up the trail 50 feet, it'll lay down like that's it. There's no more. And handlers can't explain it. And I gave a talk in front of NASR, the National Association of Search and Rescue Professionals, 2 years ago. And at the end, there was a line out the door that wanted to talk. And a large group of handlers came up and said, you know, Dave, handlers don't talk about this much, but you'd be surprised how often this happens to us, and we can't explain why. And the other thing, the other part of this is that you won't find it in newspaper articles much, and unless the victim is examined by a doctor and a doctor makes a specific public statement about it, but the victims are often found with a low-grade fever. That's an unusual occurrence. It's not something that's normal. And if the victim is found alive, they're either found unconscious or in a semi-conscious state, but very rarely do they have all of their wherewithal about them. And then this one is a big one, and I think it's getting bigger by the day, is that the people are missing shoes predominantly, secondarily clothing. And I know some people are going to say, oh, it's hypothermia, except the people take the clothes off too close to the point where they go missing. And the weather is too nice most of the time for the clothing to come off if they're claiming hypothermia. Secondarily, the people are taking shoes off where they shouldn't be taking shoes off. And that's a real conundrum. Most of these disappearances occur between, say, 2 p.m. and 6 p.m. That's the vast majority. Somehow or another, berries are involved in many of the cases, blackberries, huckleberries. And in a large percentage of these cases, if the victim is found, they're found in an area that has been previously searched. And I'm not talking once, twice, sometimes 50 times. Sometimes they're found unconscious face down on the trail the searchers were taking every day out to search. And lastly, swamps are involved in many of the disappearances on the East Coast. Sometimes the kids are found in the middle of a swamp and nobody can explain how they got there.
I saw your reference in the book to an article that must have been done on Huffington Post where they said, don't be the last in line. It's kind of macabre humor, but it's probably true if you take these cases to heart that you list in the book.
Well, exactly. And Roger Marsh wrote an article about that. And what concerned him is that being the last in line in a group or being the last in line in a family, and then you vanish, and then you're not found for days and days and days, and sometimes never found. Imagine the guilt associated with your family members who allowed you to just, you think you're in a safe environment in a county park or a national park, and you're just gone.
It seems like from reading all of the books that the only people, or the vast majority of the people who are found alive, are those who are unable, for one reason or another, to explain where they were. Either they're too young as kids, which is the big majority of the cases, or they have some kind of disability that prevents them, or they're so disoriented they can't remember anything.
Exactly correct. And
I mean, you think that's why they're allowed to come back, because they can't explain what happened to them?
It goes without saying that seems to be it. It almost seems like before these people are taken, somehow or another, they know that they have this specific disability. And I'm not talking about overtly obvious disabilities. There's a national, or a U.S. Forest Service ranger that disappeared in Arizona, and he had two sisters that had an extremely odd bone disorder. And I'm talking like 1 in 2 million or 1 in 3 million people ever have it. And he was the one person of the 3 kids that didn't have it. And for some reason, this one article about his disappearance talked about this unique point in his life. And to me, it meant a lot because he didn't have the disability, but there was something about his DNA that excluded him having that disease. And he disappeared. He was never found.
You mentioned about the intellect, either people with high intellect, college graduates, high degrees, and those with intellectually challenged people. It's as if something is culling the herd. Hey, let's pick off the best and the brightest, and while we're at it, we'll pick off the weakest and the easiest to grab.
That's a sad way to put it, but I think that after you read all of the books, I think you're going to come to that conclusion whether you want to or not.